Welcome, weary traveler, to a tale of fractured souls and hidden darkness. Tonight, let us journey through the twisted path of Tom Marvolo Riddle's greatest obsession, his quest for immortality through the darkest of magics. As you settle into your comfortable sanctuary, allow these words to carry you through the complete chronicle of Voldemort's Horcruxes, from their terrible creation to their ultimate destruction. Close your eyes and drift into this story of 7 fragments of a soul, each one a step deeper into darkness, each one a tragedy that would reshape the wizarding world forever. Welcome, weary traveler, to the shadows where ambition first whispered of immortality, where a brilliant mind began its descent into the darkest magic ever conceived. Tonight we follow the young Tom Marvolo Riddle as he discovers the forbidden knowledge that would reshape his very soul and set him upon a path from which there could be no return. As you settle into the comfort of your safe haven, let these words carry you through the birth of an obsession that would consume a man's humanity, one fragment at a time. In the hushed corridors of Hogwarts' School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, where ancient stones held centuries of accumulated wisdom and whispered secrets, there existed places that even the most curious students rarely ventured. The restricted section of the library was one such place, its shelves lined with volumes that contained knowledge too dangerous for young minds, magic too dark for innocent hearts. But Tom Riddle was neither young in spirit nor innocent in intention, and it was here, in the amber glow of forbidden learning, that he would first encounter the word that would define his existence: Horcrux. The very syllables seemed to carry weight beyond their letters, a heaviness that settled in the mind, like lead in water. Tom had discovered the term while researching the boundaries of life and death, driven by a fear so profound that it had consumed every other emotion in his carefully controlled heart. Death, that final enemy, that ultimate defeat, he would not bow to it as lesser wizards did. He would find a way to transcend mortality itself, to become something beyond the reach of time and decay. The book that contained this revelation was ancient, its pages yellowed with age and brittle beneath his careful fingers. The author had written with the trembling hand of someone who feared their own knowledge, who understood that they were documenting something that should never have been conceived. But Tom felt no such fear. Where others saw horror, he saw opportunity. Where others saw abomination, he saw evolution. The concept was elegantly simple in its monstrosity, the splitting of one's soul through the act of murder, the most unnatural crime that tore at the very fabric of being. A fragment of that damaged soul could then be bound to an object, creating an anchor that would prevent death even if the body was destroyed. It was immortality through the ultimate violation of natural law, life purchased with the currency of others' deaths. But as Tom read deeper into the forbidden text, absorbing each terrible detail with the hunger of a scholar and the coldness of a predator, he began to understand that this was merely the beginning of possibility. If one Horcrux could grant a form of immortality, what might multiple Horcruxes accomplish? The book spoke only of single creations, as if the author could not imagine anyone seeking to fracture their soul beyond that first terrible sundering. The mathematical precision of it appealed to Tom's ordered mind. 7, the most magical number, would create 8 pieces of soul, 7 Horcruxes, and the fragment that remained within his body. It would be the ultimate magical achievement, a splitting of being that would place him beyond the reach of any mortal threat. But the book provided no guidance for such an undertaking, no precedent for such ambitious application of the darkest magic. It was this uncertainty that drove Tom to seek out Professor Slughorn during one of those carefully orchestrated moments when the older wizard felt most comfortable sharing his vast knowledge with his most promising student. The potions master's office was warm and inviting, filled with crystallized pineapple and the comfortable atmosphere of academic indulgence. Here, surrounded by the trappings of ordinary magical education, Tom would ask questions that would haunt Slughorn for the rest of his life. The conversation began innocuously enough, with Tom's characteristic charm drawing the professor into comfortable discourse about advanced magical theory. Slughorn delighted in these sessions with his star pupil, proud to share his expertise with someone who so clearly appreciated the subtleties of magical knowledge. But as the evening progressed, Tom's questions began to probe darker territories, approaching the forbidden with the casual curiosity of someone asking about the weather. When Tom finally spoke the word Horcrux, the effect on Slughorn was immediate and profound. The older wizard's face went pale, his jovial manner evaporating like morning mist. This was knowledge that should not be discussed, magic that should not be contemplated, especially not by a student whose brilliance was matched only by his disturbing intensity. But Tom's persuasive powers were legendary even then. His ability to make others want to please him, operating on levels that bypassed rational thought. The answer, when it came, was delivered in hushed tones that carried the weight of terrible understanding. Yes, it was theoretically possible to create multiple Horcruxes. Yes, 7 would indeed be the most magically significant number, but the cost would be beyond imagining. Not just the murders required to split the soul, but the gradual loss of humanity that came with each fracturing. With each Horcrux created, the Maker would become less human and more monster, until what remained was barely recognizable as having once been a person. Slughorn's horror at his own words was palpable, his realization that he had just provided the key to unimaginable evil written clearly across his features. He begged Tom to forget what had been discussed, to abandon whatever dark curiosity had prompted such questions. The very existence of Horcruxes was abhorrent to nature, he explained, a violation so profound that it left scars on the fabric of reality itself. No wizard of good conscience would ever contemplate such magic, let alone pursue it to such extremes. But as Tom left the professor's office that night, his steps light with satisfaction and his mind already racing with possibilities, Slughorn knew that his words had fallen on ears deafened by ambition. He had given the most dangerous student in Hogwarts history the theoretical framework for achieving true immortality, and the weight of that knowledge would burden him for decades to come. In the days that followed, Tom's research took on a fevered intensity that went unnoticed by classmates, too intimidated by his brilliance to question his activities. He delved deeper into the darkest corners of magical theory, studying not just the mechanics of soul-splitting, but the selection of appropriate vessels and victims. For Tom understood instinctively that if he was to create 7 Horcruxes, each one must be perfect in its own way. The murders meaningful, the objects significant, the entire process elevated above mere magical experimentation to the level of dark artistry. The psychological transformation that accompanied this research was subtle but profound. Tom had always been different from his peers, marked by a coldness that went beyond mere emotional distance. But as he contemplated the systematic murder of 7 people and the fracturing of his own soul, something fundamental began to change within him. The last vestiges of human empathy, already weakened by years of manipulation and emotional isolation, began to wither entirely. He started to view other people not as individuals with their own hopes and fears, but as potential tools for his grand design. Some might serve as victims, their deaths providing the trauma necessary to split his soul. Others might be useful as guardians for his Horcruxes, their loyalty and strength protecting his immortality. All were subordinate to his vision of himself as something beyond human limitation, a being who had transcended the boundaries that constrained ordinary wizards. The selection of objects for his future Horcruxes became an obsession in itself. They must be significant, connected to his personal history or magical heritage, in ways that would make their destruction unlikely. They must be durable, capable of surviving centuries without decay or damage. Most importantly, they must be precious to him in ways that went beyond mere monetary value. For a Horcrux created in an object the maker did not truly care about would be weakened by that indifference. Tom's mind turned naturally to artifacts connected with Hogwarts itself, the place he considered his true home. The founders of the school had left behind objects of immense magical significance, items that carried not just historical importance, but genuine power accumulated over centuries of veneration. To possess such artifacts would be to hold pieces of Hogwarts' very essence. But more than that, to use them as Horcruxes would be to ensure their protection through their own significance. Salazar Slytherin's locket called to him with particular intensity, representing not just his heritage as Slytherin's heir, but his connection to the founder who had understood the importance of magical purity. Helga Hufflepuff's cup might seem a strange choice for someone who despised the soft values that Hufflepuff represented, but its antiquity and magical properties made it invaluable as a vessel for immortality. Rowena Ravenclaw's diadem, lost for centuries, would be the ultimate prize, an artifact so legendary that most believed it mythical. But beyond the founder's artifacts, Tom knew he would need other objects of personal significance. His own diary, the record of his thoughts and achievements during these crucial years, would serve as both Horcrux and weapon. The Gaunt ring, which he had not yet claimed but knew awaited him in the hovel where his mother's family lived in squalor, represented his connection to Salazar Slytherin through blood rather than mere allegiance. As winter deepened around Hogwarts and his final year at the school approached its end, Tom began to make more concrete plans for the implementation of his grand design. The murders would need to be carefully selected and executed, each one advancing his goals while avoiding suspicion. The creation of each Horcrux would require precise magical technique and absolute emotional control, for any hesitation or remorse could weaken the binding and compromise his immortality. The transformation was now complete in all but execution. The brilliant, charming student who had once been Tom Riddle was evolving into something else entirely, something that would one day be known by a name that struck terror into the hearts of all who heard it. Lord Voldemort was being born in the quiet hours spent studying forbidden magic, his humanity dying by degrees as he prepared to murder it entirely through acts of unspeakable evil. His classmates noticed subtle changes, a coldness in his smile that hadn't been there before, a distance in his eyes that suggested he was seeing them not as people but as objects of potential use. His teachers began to feel uncomfortable in his presence, sensing something predatory beneath his perfect manners and academic excellence. But none suspected the true scope of what was growing in their midst, the monster that was learning to wear human form with ever-decreasing conviction. The restricted section continued to yield its secrets to his patient research, volumes of dark knowledge opening themselves to his brilliant mind like flowers turning toward a black sun. He learned of the rituals that could restore a body to a disembodied soul, the magic that could sustain life beyond natural limits, the binding spells that could ensure loyalty unto death and beyond. Each piece of knowledge was filed away with meticulous care, stored against future need in a mind that forgot nothing of importance. But perhaps the most crucial realization that came to Tom during this period was the understanding that his quest for immortality would require patience beyond normal human comprehension. The creation of 7 Horcruxes could not be rushed, could not be accomplished in the span of months or even years. It would be the work of decades, requiring careful planning and perfect execution at every stage. He would need to build a reputation, gather followers, accumulate power and resources that would allow him to operate beyond the reach of magical law enforcement. The vision that sustained him through these final months at Hogwarts was one of ultimate triumph, himself as an immortal being ruling over a magical world remade according to his will, surrounded by artifacts of unimaginable power, served by followers whose loyalty had been ensured through magic far more binding than mere admiration. Death would be a stranger to him, age a concept that applied only to lesser beings. He would be eternal, perfect, beyond the reach of any force that existed in the natural world. As his time at Hogwarts drew toward its close, Tom felt a mixture of anticipation and nostalgia that surprised him with its intensity. The school had been more than an educational institution. It had been the place where he first understood his own exceptional nature, where he had learned to harness powers that others could barely comprehend. Leaving it would be painful, but necessary. The real world awaited, with its opportunities for power and its abundance of potential victims. The last days of his education were spent in careful observation and planning, noting the routines and weaknesses of those around him, identifying opportunities that might not present themselves again. Some of his classmates would live long, productive lives, never knowing how close they had come to serving a darker purpose. Others would not be so fortunate, their names destined to become footnotes in the terrible chronicle of Lord Voldemort's rise to power. But all of that lay in the future, separated from the present by years of preparation and growth. For now, Tom Riddle was still a student, still bound by the constraints of his youth and limited resources. The monster that would terrorize the wizarding world was yet to be born, existing only in potential, waiting for the first murder that would begin the systematic destruction of everything human within him. The birth of darkness was complete in theory, but not yet in practice. The knowledge had been acquired, the plans had been made, the psychological foundation had been laid. All that remained was the execution, the first terrible step on a path that would lead to immortality purchased with the blood of innocence and the complete corruption of what had once been a human soul. In the depths of Hogwarts Castle, where ancient magic flowed through stone corridors like blood through veins, the 6th year of Tom Marvolo Riddle's education was drawing toward a close that would forever alter the course of wizarding history. The knowledge he had gleaned from forbidden texts and Professor Slughorn's reluctant revelations had taken root in his brilliant mind like a dark seed, growing with each passing day into something that demanded action. The time for theory had ended, and the moment for terrible practice had arrived. The Chamber of Secrets had been calling to him throughout his years at Hogwarts, its existence a whispered legend that most dismissed as elaborate myth. But Tom knew better. His research into the school's history had revealed the truth behind the founder's departure. Salazar Slytherin had indeed built a hidden chamber within the castle, a sanctuary where his heir might one day fulfill the vision of a Hogwarts purged of those deemed unworthy of magical education. The Muggle-born students who walked the halls in ignorance of their precarious position were living proof that Slytherin's dream had never been realized. For Tom, the chamber represented far more than mere historical curiosity or even ideological validation. It was the perfect setting for his first act of murder, the crime that would split his soul and begin his journey toward immortality. The beast that Slytherin had left sleeping in the depths was a weapon of unparalleled power, capable of killing with a glance and leaving no trace that mortal magic could detect. More importantly, its actions could be attributed to the legendary monster rather than to any human agency, providing the perfect cover for what he intended to accomplish. The diary that would serve as his first Horcrux lay open before him in the privacy of his dormitory, its blank pages waiting to receive not just his thoughts and experiences, but a fragment of his very soul. He had chosen it carefully from among his possessions, understanding that this particular Horcrux would serve a dual purpose. Unlike the others he planned to create, this one would not be hidden away for protection but would instead become a weapon in its own right, capable of acting independently to continue his work even in his absence. The magic required to bind a piece of soul to an inanimate object was complex, beyond the comprehension of most wizards, requiring not just theoretical knowledge, but a depth of understanding about the nature of existence itself. Tom had spent months preparing, studying the ancient rituals and incantations that would make the binding possible. But more than magical technique, the process demanded something far more precious: the deliberate destruction of his own humanity through the act of murder. The selection of a victim had occupied his thoughts for weeks, as he observed his fellow students with the calculating gaze of a predator choosing prey. The murder must be significant enough to achieve the soul-splitting he required, but the victim must be someone whose death would serve his larger purposes. Too important a target would attract unwanted attention and investigation. Too insignificant, and the act might fail to provide the trauma necessary for the Horcrux creation. His choice fell upon Myrtle Warren, a second-year Ravenclaw whose existence was marked more by tears than triumph. She was a lonely girl, overlooked by classmates and teachers alike, her days spent in solitary misery that made her almost invisible within the school's social hierarchy. Her academic performance was mediocre, her magical abilities unremarkable, her family connections non-existent. She was, in Tom's cold calculation, the perfect victim, someone whose death would cause minimal disruption while still providing the soul-shattering trauma he required. But beyond her suitability as a sacrifice, Myrtle's death would serve another crucial purpose. The opening of the Chamber of Secrets needed to appear as the work of the legendary monster rather than any human agency. A student death that could be attributed to the basilisk would validate the ancient legends and create the atmosphere of terror necessary to conceal Tom's true role in the events. The school's administration would be so focused on the mythical threat that they would never suspect a student was orchestrating the horror from within their own ranks. The location he chose for the confrontation was perfect in its mundane horror: a girl's bathroom on the second floor that Myrtle frequented during her episodes of particularly intense crying. The chamber could be accessed through the plumbing system, its entrance hidden behind facades of ordinary school architecture that had concealed Slytherin's secret for 1,000 years. Here, in a place associated with daily routine and adolescent embarrassment, Tom would commit the act that would forever separate him from the human race. The weeks leading up to the murder were spent in careful preparation that went far beyond the magical aspects of Horcrux creation. Tom studied Myrtle's routines with the patience of a hunter, learning when she was most likely to be alone and vulnerable. He practiced the Parseltongue commands that would control the basilisk, ensuring that his control over the ancient serpent would be absolute and unquestionable. Most importantly, he prepared himself psychologically for the act he was about to commit, systematically suppressing any remaining traces of conscience or empathy that might interfere with his purpose. The night he finally acted was unremarkable in every way except for what it would unleash upon the wizarding world. The castle slept in peaceful ignorance. As Tom made his way through corridors, he knew better than any other student, his footsteps silent on stones, worn smooth by centuries of passing feet. The magic that protected Hogwarts recognized him as belonging within its walls, never suspecting that he carried darkness that could corrupt everything the school represented. The entrance to the chamber revealed itself at his Parseltongue command, ancient mechanisms responding to the blood of Slytherin that flowed in his veins. The descent into the depths was like traveling backward through time, each step taking him further from the civilized world above and deeper into the primordial darkness that Salazar Slytherin had carved from the living rock. The air grew colder and more oppressive as he descended, thick with the weight of 1,000 years of patient waiting. The chamber itself was a cathedral of darkness, its vast spaces echoing with whispers that spoke of power and purity, and the terrible price of both. Massive stone serpents coiled around pillars that supported a ceiling lost in shadows, their carved eyes seeming to track his movement with approval and anticipation. At the far end of the chamber, the statue of Salazar Slytherin gazed down with the expression of a man who had seen the future and found it wanting, his stone features bearing the weight of prophecy and purpose. But it was not the architecture that commanded Tom's attention, but the presence he could sense stirring in the depths, the basilisk that had slumbered here for centuries, waiting for the heir of Slytherin to call it forth. The serpent was ancient beyond mortal comprehension, its body grown massive through decades of patient growth in the darkness. Its venom was deadly beyond any known antidote, its gaze an instrument of instant death that had been crafted by Slytherin himself as the ultimate weapon against those he deemed unworthy of magical knowledge. The conversation between heir and beast was conducted in the sibilant tones of Parseltongue, words that bypassed rational thought to speak directly to the reptilian consciousness that drove the creature's existence. Tom explained what he required. Not wholesale slaughter that would close the school and end his education, but selective killing that would serve his purposes while maintaining the facade of random monster attacks. The basilisk listened with the patient attention of a weapon awaiting deployment, understanding that its time of action had finally arrived after centuries of enforced slumber. The command, when it came, was given with the casual tone of someone ordering a house elf to clean a room. Death, in the language of serpents, was just another word, no more significant than instructions for where to strike or when to retreat. The basilisk flowed through the ancient plumbing with liquid grace, its massive form somehow fitting through spaces that seemed impossibly small, guided by instincts that had been honed by a millennium of hunger and patient waiting. Myrtle Warren died without understanding what was happening to her, the basilisk's gaze ending her life so quickly that terror had no time to register on her features. Her last moments were spent in the same misery that had defined her existence, crying alone in a bathroom stall, mourning some small social cruelty that would seem insignificant compared to the cosmic injustice of her death. She became a ghost in the moment of her dying, her spirit trapped by the violent manner of her passing and the unfinished business of a life cut short before it had truly begun. But if Myrtle's death was swift and unremarkable, its effect on Tom Riddle was profound beyond description. The moment her life ended, he felt something fundamental tear within his chest, a ripping sensation that seemed to reach into the very core of his being and split it like lightning splitting wood. The pain was indescribable, not physical but metaphysical, the agony of a soul being forcibly divided against its nature. For a moment that lasted an eternity, he existed in a state of pure fragmentation, his consciousness scattered like stars across an infinite void. The recovery was gradual and incomplete, leaving him changed in ways that he could sense but not fully comprehend. Something essential had been lost in that moment of division, some quality that had connected him to the human experience in ways so fundamental that he had never realized their importance. Empathy became an abstract concept that he could understand intellectually but no longer feel. Love transformed from emotion to weakness, compassion from virtue to vulnerability. He was still Tom Riddle, but he was also something else, something less human and more terrible. The creation of the Horcrux itself required rituals so dark that even the forbidden books spoke of them only in whispers and circumlocutions. Working by the light of candles that burned with flames the color of old blood, Tom bound the fragment of his soul to the diary through incantations that seemed to pain the very air around him. The words were in languages that predated civilized magic, tongues that had been spoken in the dawn times when the boundaries between life and death were more fluid and far more dangerous. The diary changed as it received its terrible burden, its innocent pages darkening with shadows that moved independently of any light source. The binding was strong, far stronger than Tom had dared hope, creating not just a repository for his soul fragment, but something approaching independent consciousness. This Horcrux would be different from the others he planned to create. Not merely an anchor to life, but a weapon capable of acting on his behalf, even when he was absent or destroyed. The basilisk returned to its hiding place with the satisfied languor of a predator that had finally been allowed to hunt, its ancient consciousness content in the knowledge that it had served its purpose and would likely be called upon again. The chamber sealed itself behind Tom as he made his way back to the upper levels of the castle, its secrets once again hidden behind mundane facades that had protected Slytherin's legacy for 1,000 years. The discovery of Myrtle's body the following morning created exactly the atmosphere of terror and confusion that Tom had intended. Teachers rushed through corridors with wands drawn, searching for threats they could not name or comprehend. Students huddled together in frightened groups, whispering theories that grew more elaborate and less accurate with each retelling. The very stones of Hogwarts seemed to absorb the fear and reflect it back, amplified, creating an environment where rational thought became increasingly difficult and panic increasingly likely. But Tom moved through this chaos with the calm of someone who understood exactly what was happening and why, his performance of shock and concern so perfect that even those who knew him well never suspected his involvement. He comforted frightened students with words of reassurance that he did not mean, expressed horror at violence he had orchestrated, and offered theories about the perpetrator that led investigators away from any possibility of student involvement. The ministry's response was swift but ultimately futile, their investigators bringing techniques designed for human criminals to bear on what they believed was the work of a legendary monster. They found no magical signatures because Tom had left none, no evidence of forced entry because the killer had come from within the very structure of the castle itself. The scene yielded no clues because the true crime had been the creation of the Horcrux rather than the mere murder that had enabled it. As weeks passed and the investigation stalled, Tom began to implement the second phase of his plan, the selection and framing of someone else for Myrtle's murder. His choice fell upon Rubeus Hagrid, a fellow student whose love of dangerous creatures and half-giant heritage made him a perfect scapegoat. Hagrid's academic record was poor, his magical control questionable, and his judgment regarding dangerous animals notably absent. More importantly, he possessed something that could plausibly be mistaken for the murder weapon, Aragog, an acromantula that Hagrid had been secretly raising in violation of school regulations. The framing required delicate work, the planting of evidence that would seem genuine while protecting the real perpetrator from suspicion. Tom used his considerable charm and influence to spread rumors about Hagrid's dangerous pets, to raise questions about the half-giant's stability and judgment. When the trap was finally sprung, and Hagrid was discovered with Aragog, the case seemed so obvious that few bothered to look deeper into the circumstances. The expulsion of Hagrid and the apparent resolution of the crisis allowed Hogwarts to return to something approaching normalcy. But Tom knew that the damage to his soul was permanent and irreversible. He carried within himself a wound that would never heal, a fundamental alteration that separated him from everything he had been before that terrible night in the chamber. But he also carried something else, proof that his theories about Horcruxes were correct, that immortality was possible for those willing to pay its price in blood and spiritual destruction. The diary Horcrux rested among his possessions like a sleeping serpent, its dark consciousness patient and waiting for the day when it would be called upon to serve. Unlike the other Horcruxes he planned to create, this one would not be hidden away for protection, but would instead be used as a weapon, deployed against future enemies when the time was right. It was his first step toward immortality, but it was also his first step away from humanity, the beginning of a transformation that would ultimately consume everything that Tom Riddle had ever been. As his 6th year at Hogwarts drew toward its close, Tom reflected on what he had accomplished and what still lay ahead. 1 Horcrux was complete, but 6 more remained to be created before his quest for immortality would be finished. 6 more murders lay in his future, 6 more acts of soul-splitting that would further distance him from the human experience. The path stretched ahead of him like a dark river, carrying him toward a destiny that he had chosen, but whose ultimate cost he had not yet fully comprehended. The boy who had entered the Chamber of Secrets was gone forever, replaced by something that wore his face but carried a fractured soul. Tom Riddle was evolving into Lord Voldemort, one murder at a time, each act of violence stripping away another layer of humanity until only the monster would remain. The diary hidden among his school books was more than just his first Horcrux. It was the gravestone marker of his former self, the memorial to the last night when Tom Riddle had been entirely human. The transformation was irreversible now, the first terrible step on a journey that would lead through decades of darkness toward an immortality purchased with the blood of innocence. But for now, the school slept peacefully around him, protected by wards that recognized him as one of their own, never suspecting that they harbored within their walls the greatest threat the wizarding world had ever known. The monster was awakening, but it still wore the face of a brilliant student, and in that deception lay its greatest power and most terrible danger. In the summer that followed his 6th year at Hogwarts, as the warmth of July settled over the wizarding world like a comfortable blanket concealing darker truths beneath, Tom Marvolo Riddle embarked upon a journey that would complete his transformation from brilliant student to something far more terrible. The creation of his first Horcrux had changed him in ways both subtle and profound, stripping away layers of humanity that he had not realized he possessed until they were gone forever. But that first terrible act had also awakened within him a hunger for knowledge about his own origins, a need to understand the bloodlines that had created him and the legacy he was destined to claim. The research that consumed his days in the weeks following his return from Hogwarts was conducted with the methodical precision of a scholar and the cold determination of a predator. The name Marvolo, which he bore as his middle name, had always seemed significant to him in ways that went beyond mere family tradition. There was power in names, particularly in the wizarding world, and Tom had learned to pay attention to such details as others might ignore. His investigations into genealogical records and family histories led him through dusty archives and forgotten documents, each piece of information adding another fragment to the puzzle of his heritage. The discovery that his grandfather had borne the same name was the key that unlocked centuries of family history, revealing connections that reached back through generations of wizards whose blood carried the legacy of Salazar Slytherin himself. The Gaunt family, he learned, had once been among the most powerful pure-blood families in magical Britain, their lineage stretching back to the very founding of Hogwarts itself. But power without wisdom was a poison that corrupted from within, and the Gaunts had succumbed to the very pride that should have been their greatest strength. The decline of the family was a study in the gradual erosion of greatness through inbreeding and isolationism, each generation becoming more unstable and more removed from the world beyond their increasingly squalid existence. What had once been a noble house had devolved into something barely distinguishable from the muggle poverty that surrounded their hovel, their magical abilities intact, but their judgment and sanity compromised by centuries of genetic narrowing and social decay. Tom's journey to Little Hangleton in late July was undertaken with the excitement of an explorer about to discover a new continent and the cold calculation of someone planning a conquest. The village itself was unremarkable in every way, a collection of modest houses and shops that had probably changed little in the centuries since the Gaunts had first settled in the area. But for Tom, it represented the physical manifestation of his heritage, the place where his mother's people had preserved the blood of Slytherin through generations of careful magical breeding. The Gaunt house, when he finally located it hidden among overgrown hedges and forgotten lanes, was a monument to fallen greatness that spoke volumes about the family's decline from power to obscurity. The building itself was barely habitable, its walls cracked and sagging, its windows grimy with decades of accumulated neglect. But Tom's enhanced senses, sharpened by his recent communion with the darkest magics, could detect the residual power that clung to the structure like morning mist. This had been a place of magical significance, and traces of that significance lingered despite the poverty and decay that had consumed everything else. The man who answered Tom's knock was a living embodiment of his family's deterioration, his appearance so disheveled, and his manner so wild, that he might have been mistaken for a madman, rather than the heir to one of Wizarding Britain's most ancient bloodlines. Morfin Gaunt possessed his nephew's distinctive features in corrupted form, the aristocratic bone structure twisted by malnutrition, and the intelligent eyes clouded by years of isolation and magical inbreeding. But he also wore something that made Tom's heart race with anticipation and desire. A ring that bore the unmistakable mark of his Slytherin heritage. The ring itself was a masterwork of ancient craftsmanship, its gold band inscribed with symbols that spoke of power and permanence in languages older than recorded history. But it was the stone set within that band that truly captured Tom's attention. A black stone carved with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe in the uncertain light, emanating an aura of darkness that called to something fundamental in his nature. This was more than mere jewelry. It was a talisman of his bloodline, a physical connection to the founder whose legacy he was destined to claim. Morfin's rambling conversation revealed details about Tom's parentage that filled him with a rage so pure and cold that it felt almost refreshing in its intensity. His father, Tom Riddle Sr., had been nothing more than a handsome muggle who had caught the eye of Merope Gaunt during one of her rare ventures beyond the family's self-imposed isolation. The love potion that had ensnared the elder Tom Riddle was a violation of natural law that had produced a son whose very existence was built upon deception and magical coercion. But worse than the circumstances of his conception was the revelation of his abandonment. How his father had fled the moment Merope had stopped administering the love potion, abandoning his pregnant wife to die in poverty and despair while he returned to his comfortable muggle existence. The man who had contributed half of Tom's genetic heritage had proven himself a coward of the most contemptible sort, someone who lacked the strength to face the consequences of his choices, or the character to stand by the woman who had borne his child. The manor house that Tom Riddle Sr. had returned to stood like an accusation on the hill overlooking Little Hangleton, its windows glowing warmly in the evening light as if mocking the squalor of the gaunt hovel below. Here lived the man whose blood ran in Tom's veins, but whose character represented everything he despised about the non-magical world: weakness, ignorance, the inability to grasp the significance of the magical forces that shaped reality itself. The decision to confront his father was made in an instant, driven by a fury that demanded immediate satisfaction and a strategic mind that recognized opportunity when it presented itself. The walk up the hill to Riddle Manor was a pilgrimage of sorts, each step carrying Tom closer to a confrontation that would define not just his relationship with his own heritage, but his understanding of the price that immortality demanded. The elder Tom Riddle would serve a dual purpose. His death would provide the soul-splitting trauma necessary for the creation of a second Horcrux, while his murder would satisfy the rage that had been building in Tom's chest since Morphin's revelations about his abandonment. The manor itself was everything that the Gaunt hovel was not: well-maintained, prosperous, a testament to the comfortable ignorance of the Muggle world that proceeded through its daily routines without ever suspecting the magical forces that operated just beyond its perception. The gardens were immaculate, the windows clean and bright, the very air seeming to carry the scent of security and satisfaction that came from a life lived without significant challenges or profound responsibilities. Tom Riddle Sr. answered the door himself, perhaps called by some instinct to face the son he had never known existed. The physical resemblance between them was unmistakable and deeply unsettling. The same dark hair, the same sharp features, the same tall frame that suggested aristocratic breeding despite their vastly different upbringings. But where the father carried himself with the casual confidence of someone who had never truly been tested, the son radiated a controlled intensity that spoke of powers and purposes beyond normal human comprehension. The conversation that followed was brief and laden with revelations that neither participant could fully process in the moment. Tom Sr.'s shock at discovering he had a son was genuine and profound, but it was mixed with the automatic defensiveness of someone who recognized that his past choices were about to demand payment in ways he had never anticipated. He had convinced himself that his abandonment of Merope had been necessary and justified, that a man of his social position could not be expected to remain bound by magical coercion regardless of its consequences. But as he looked into eyes that were unmistakably his own yet filled with a coldness he had never possessed, Tom Sr. began to understand that his sins had taken on physical form and returned to demand satisfaction. The young man who stood before him was everything he might have been if his life had been shaped by different forces: brilliant where he was merely clever, powerful where he was simply privileged, dangerous where he was merely comfortable. The revelation of magic, demonstrated through spells that transformed the comfortable sitting room into something approaching a torture chamber, shattered Tom Sr.'s worldview so completely that his mind struggled to process what he was witnessing. The furniture rearranged itself according to his son's will. The very air grew thick with power that pressed against his skin like invisible hands, and the comfortable certainties of his Muggle existence crumbled like sand before the tide of supernatural force that his abandonment had unleashed upon the world. The murder itself was conducted with the clinical precision that had become Tom's hallmark in matters of life and death. The killing curse that ended his father's existence was cast without hesitation or remorse, its green light filling the room like the glow of corrupted starlight. There was no struggle, no prolonged suffering, simply the instantaneous transition from life to death that left the elder Tom Riddle's body unmarked, but his soul departed forever. But Tom's vengeance was not complete with a single death. The Muggle family that had welcomed his father back from his magical entanglement, his stepmother, and half-siblings who had profited from his abandonment of his magical wife, were equally guilty in Tom's judgment. They had provided the sanctuary that had allowed his father to forget Merope's existence, had created the comfortable life that had made abandonment seem preferable to responsibility. Their deaths followed in quick succession. Each life ended with the same cold efficiency that had claimed Tom Sr. The return to the Gaunt hovel was undertaken with the satisfaction of justice served and the anticipation of reward claimed. Morfin, already confused by years of isolation and magical inbreeding, was easily manipulated through memory charms and false evidence that would make him appear responsible for the murders that Tom had committed. The modified memories were crafted with artistic precision, creating a narrative that would satisfy the authorities while concealing the true perpetrator's identity. The theft of the Gaunt ring was almost anticlimactic after the emotional intensity of the murders, but its significance to Tom's long-term plans could not be overstated. This was not merely a piece of valuable jewelry, but a tangible connection to his Slytherin heritage, proof of his rightful claim to the legacy that Salazar had established at Hogwarts 1,000 years earlier. More than that, it would serve as the perfect vessel for his second Horcrux, combining personal significance with historical importance in ways that would make its destruction unthinkable to anyone who understood its true value. The creation of the second Horcrux followed the same rituals that had bound his first soul fragment to the diary, but the process was somehow both easier and more terrible than before. His soul, already damaged by the previous splitting, seemed almost eager to divide again, as if the act of fracturing had created a weakness that made subsequent divisions inevitable. The pain was still excruciating, still left him feeling fundamentally altered and diminished, but there was also a growing sense of power that came from each successful step toward immortality. The ring absorbed the soul fragment with an eagerness that surprised Tom, its dark stone seeming to pulse with malevolent life as the binding took hold. Unlike the diary, which had become an active and interactive repository for his consciousness, the ring settled into a quieter form of malevolence, its evil more subtle but no less profound. It would serve not as a weapon, but as an anchor, a hidden guardian of his immortality that would remain concealed until the day when enemies might threaten his carefully constructed network of soul fragments. The hiding place he chose for the ring reflected both strategic thinking and emotional symbolism that revealed the complexity of his relationship with his own heritage. The ruins of the Gaunt house, abandoned after Morfin's arrest and conviction for the Riddle murders, provided both security and significance that more obvious locations could not match. Here, among the decaying remnants of his mother's family home, his Horcrux would be protected by obscurity and defended by magical traps that would claim the life of anyone foolish enough to disturb its rest. The protective enchantments that Tom wove around the hidden ring were masterworks of defensive magic that drew upon knowledge gleaned from the darkest corners of forbidden learning, curses that would activate upon touch, hexes that would track intruders through their magical signatures, jinxes that would multiply and intensify with each attempt to dispel them. The ring became the center of a web of malevolent magic that could destroy even experienced wizards who approached it without proper preparation and protection. But perhaps the most insidious protection was psychological rather than magical, the curse that would overwhelm anyone who wore the ring with visions of their deepest desires fulfilled. Tom understood that heroes and treasure hunters were often undone not by external obstacles, but by their own weaknesses, their inability to resist temptations that promised to give them everything they had ever wanted. The ring would prey upon these weaknesses, offering visions of resurrected loved ones and achieved ambitions, while slowly draining the life from anyone foolish enough to place it upon their finger. The return journey to London was undertaken in a state of profound satisfaction mixed with growing anticipation for the work that still lay ahead. 2 Horcruxes now existed in the world, 2 anchors that would prevent his death even if his body was destroyed by enemies or circumstances beyond his control. But 5 more remained to be created before his vision of perfect immortality could be realized. 5 more murders that would complete the systematic destruction of his soul in service of eternal life. The psychological changes that accompanied each act of soul-splitting were becoming more pronounced and more disturbing, even to Tom's increasingly clinical self-awareness. Emotions that had once provided color and meaning to his existence were fading like photographs left too long in sunlight, leaving him with intellectual understanding of feelings he could no longer truly experience. Love, compassion, regret. These became abstract concepts that he could manipulate in others, but could no longer feel himself. But if he was losing his capacity for positive emotions, his ability to experience satisfaction and triumph seemed to grow stronger with each successful step toward his ultimate goal. The deaths of his father and his family had provided not just the trauma necessary for Horcrux creation, but a deep sense of justice served and destiny fulfilled. He was no longer merely Tom Riddle, the abandoned half-blood, whose very existence was a testament to his father's weakness and cowardice. He was becoming something greater and more terrible, something that would make the wizarding world remember the name he had chosen to replace the one his failed parents had given him. Lord Voldemort was more than a pseudonym. It was a promise and a prophecy, a name that would strike terror into the hearts of those who heard it, and inspire fanatical loyalty in those who chose to serve its bearer. The murders at Little Hangleton had been the first public acts committed under that name, though the world would not learn of their true perpetrator for many years to come. Morfin Gaunt would die in Azkaban, believing himself guilty of crimes he had not committed, while the real killer walked free to continue his work of reshaping the wizarding world according to his vision of magical supremacy. The Gaunt ring rested in its hiding place like a sleeping serpent, its dark stone containing not just a fragment of Tom's soul, but all the rage and hatred that had driven him to murder his own blood. It was proof that he could kill anyone when circumstances demanded it, that family bonds and genetic heritage meant nothing compared to the greater goal of achieving immortality. The boy who had once yearned to know his father was gone forever, replaced by someone who had proven his superiority by destroying the man whose weaknesses he refused to inherit. As summer faded toward autumn and the time approached for his return to Hogwarts for his 7th and final year, Tom reflected on how much he had accomplished and how much remained to be done. The path toward immortality was becoming clearer with each successful step, but it was also revealing itself to be longer and more complex than he had initially imagined. The creation of 7 Horcruxes would require not just 7 murders, but 7 perfect crimes, 7 acts of violence so carefully planned and executed that they would never be traced back to their true perpetrator. The ring that bore his family's legacy now served a darker purpose than its creators had ever imagined, transformed from a symbol of pure blood pride into an anchor for a soul so corrupted that it could no longer be considered entirely human. It was a fitting fate for an heirloom that had been worn by generations of wizards who had allowed their heritage to become a prison rather than a foundation for greatness. Tom had claimed his inheritance, but he had also transcended it, proving himself worthy of the Slytherin legacy through actions that his ancestors had lacked the vision and courage to attempt. The second Horcrux was complete, and with it, another step toward the immortality that would elevate him beyond the reach of death and time itself. But immortality was not an end in itself, but merely the foundation for achievements that would dwarf anything accomplished by previous generations of dark wizards. With eternal life secured, he would have unlimited time to pursue the reshaping of the wizarding world. The elimination of magical dilution through Muggle contamination, and the establishment of a new order where power and purity would determine worth rather than the accidents of birth and circumstance that had governed society for too long. The blood of his father had purchased the second fragment of his immortal soul, and Tom felt no regret for the transaction. Weakness deserved destruction, cowardice merited death, and abandonment demanded the ultimate punishment. The ring that now guarded a piece of his soul was proof that he had chosen correctly, that the path toward greatness required the systematic elimination of every force that might limit his potential or constrain his vision. The boy who had been abandoned was gone, replaced by someone who would never again be vulnerable to the failures and weaknesses that had defined his origins. The employment that awaited Tom Riddle upon his graduation from Hogwarts represented both opportunity and irony in measures that would have amused him had he retained the capacity for such subtle appreciation. Borgin and Burke's, that most notorious establishment in Nocturne Alley, where darkness masqueraded as commerce and evil wore the respectable face of antique dealing, had offered him a position that seemed tailor-made for his particular talents. Here, among objects that whispered of forgotten curses and artifacts that pulsed with malevolent energy, he would have access to treasures that most wizards could only dream of possessing. The shop itself was a labyrinth of shadows and secrets, its narrow aisles crowded with items that had been collected from the estates of dead wizards and the private collections of those whose circumstances had forced them to part with their most precious possessions. Cursed jewelry glittered in glass cases beside books bound in materials that had once been living creatures, while paintings whose subjects had fled their frames in terror stood propped against walls that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. It was a museum of magical malevolence disguised as a legitimate business, and Tom felt more at home among its offerings than he ever had in the sanitized corridors of Hogwarts. His role as a procurer of rare items required him to venture into the private homes of wizarding families whose fortunes had declined to the point where selling their heirlooms became necessary for survival. It was work that suited his talents perfectly, combining his natural charm with his ability to recognize objects of genuine power among the clutter of ordinary possessions that filled most magical households. He had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when a seemingly innocent trinket carried enchantments that made it valuable beyond its apparent worth, when a dusty portrait concealed watching eyes that had observed centuries of family secrets. But more than his ability to identify valuable objects, Tom possessed an almost supernatural talent for persuading their owners to part with treasures they had never intended to sell. His charm worked on levels that went beyond mere social manipulation, tapping into deep psychological needs for approval and acceptance that allowed him to convince even the most reluctant sellers that they were making wise decisions rather than tragic mistakes. He understood instinctively how to present himself as trustworthy and knowledgeable, how to make his targets feel that they were confiding in a friend rather than negotiating with a predator. The commissions he earned from these transactions were substantial, but money had never been Tom's primary motivation. What truly drew him to the work was the access it provided to the private collections of old wizarding families, the opportunity to examine artifacts that had been hidden away for generations, and to learn the histories that accompanied objects of genuine magical significance. Each house he visited was a potential treasure trove of knowledge and power. Each elderly witch or wizard, a repository of stories that might contain information useful to his larger purposes. It was during one of these acquisitions visits, in the elegant townhouse of a widow whose family had accumulated magical artifacts for 3 centuries, that Tom first encountered Hepzibah Smith and the treasures that would become his 3rd and 4th Horcruxes. The woman herself was a study in the particular form of genteel decay that afflicted old wizarding families whose fortunes had outlasted their vitality, her once grand home filled with possessions that spoke of better times and more illustrious ancestors. She greeted him with the desperate enthusiasm of someone who rarely received visitors, her loneliness making her pathetically eager to impress the charming young man who had come to appraise her collection. Hepzibah's need for company and validation made her an ideal target for Tom's particular skills. and he cultivated their relationship with the patience of a gardener tending a prize-winning bloom. He visited her regularly over the course of several months, each encounter carefully orchestrated to deepen her trust while gradually leading the conversation toward the most valuable items in her collection. She began to look forward to his visits with an intensity that bordered on romantic attachment, though she was far too proper to acknowledge such feelings openly. The revelation of her greatest treasures came during a visit in late autumn, when the shortened days and approaching winter seemed to intensify her need for companionship and conversation. She had prepared tea with unusual care, her best china and silverware arranged with the precision of someone trying to recreate the elegant entertainments of her youth. But it was not the refreshments that captured Tom's attention, but the subtle hints she dropped about possessions that she had never shown to any of Borgin and Berks's representatives, items that were too precious and too significant to be trusted to ordinary appraisers. The anticipation that built as she led him to her private study was almost unbearable in its intensity, like the moment before a predator strikes when every sense is heightened to supernatural clarity. The room itself was a shrine to her family's history, its walls lined with portraits of ancestors whose painted eyes seemed to track their movement with approval and curiosity. But Tom's attention was immediately drawn to a cabinet that occupied the place of honor beside her desk, its contents protected by glass that had been charmed to resist both magical and physical intrusion. Within that cabinet rested two objects that made Tom's heart race with desire so pure and overwhelming that he had to exercise every ounce of his considerable self-control to maintain his facade of professional interest. The first was Helga Hufflepuff's cup, its golden surface inscribed with badges that seemed to move in the uncertain light, its rim set with gems that had been gathered from every corner of the magical world during the founder's lifetime. The second was even more precious to him, Salazar Slytherin's locket, that legendary artifact whose very existence had been disputed by historians for centuries. The story Hepzibah told of how these treasures had come into her possession was a tale of declining fortunes and desperate circumstances that had become all too common in the wizarding world. The cup had been sold to her grandfather by a Hufflepuff descendant whose gambling debts had overwhelmed his family's resources, while the locket had been acquired from a pregnant woman who had appeared at their door one winter night, desperate for gold to pay for food and shelter. The description of that woman, young, beautiful, and bearing the distinctive features of the Gaunt bloodline, left no doubt in Tom's mind about her identity. His mother, Merope Gaunt, had sold Slytherin's locket to buy bread while carrying the child who would one day claim it as his rightful inheritance. The irony was so perfect that it seemed like destiny itself had orchestrated the circumstances, ensuring that the artifact would be preserved and waiting for him when he was ready to claim his heritage. But more than irony, the revelation filled him with a rage so cold and pure that it felt like ice forming in his veins. His mother had possessed one of the most significant magical artifacts in existence, a treasure that connected her directly to the founder of Slytherin House, and she had sold it for Muggle gold to survive her abandonment by his cowardly father. The weeks that followed that revelation were spent in careful planning that drew upon every skill Tom had developed during his years of manipulation and deception. Hepzibah's trust in him was complete, but that trust would also make her death more challenging to accomplish without suspicion falling upon him. She had spoken to friends about his visits, had mentioned his interest in her collection to other potential clients of Borgin and Berks. His disappearance from her life immediately before her death would create exactly the kind of pattern that competent investigators might recognize and pursue. But Tom had learned to think several moves ahead in the deadly game he was playing, to plan not just for immediate success but for long-term security and concealment. The solution he devised was elegant in its simplicity and terrible in its execution. He would kill Hepzibah in a manner that appeared natural, then modify the memories of all witnesses to create an alternative narrative that would deflect suspicion while allowing him to claim the treasures he had come to acquire. The poison he selected was one of the most insidious substances in the magical pharmacopoeia, a compound that mimicked the effects of heart failure so perfectly that only the most detailed examination would reveal its true nature. More importantly, it was a poison that worked slowly, allowing the killer to be far from the scene when death finally occurred. Hepzibah would appear to have died peacefully in her sleep, another elderly witch whose heart had finally succumbed to the accumulated strain of a long and comfortable life. The murder itself was accomplished during what appeared to be a perfectly ordinary social visit. The poison administered through tea that Hepzibah had prepared with her own hands, using ingredients that Tom had thoughtfully provided as a gift from his travels. She accepted his offering with the pathetic gratitude of someone who had been starved for genuine kindness, never suspecting that the exotic herbs he claimed would improve her digestion contained compounds that would stop her heart within hours of consumption. The conversation that accompanied their final tea together was conducted with Tom's characteristic charm and attention, his manner so perfectly calibrated to her emotional needs that she would go to her grave believing herself cared for and appreciated. He listened to her stories with apparent fascination, complimented her appearance with just the right degree of gallantry, and promised to return soon with additional treasures for her consideration. It was a masterful performance that left his victim feeling happier and more valued than she had in years, even as the poison began its slow work within her failing body. The theft of the cup and locket was accomplished with the clinical efficiency that had become Tom's hallmark in matters requiring both speed and precision. The protective charms on Hepzibah's cabinet were sophisticated, but not beyond the abilities of someone who had spent years studying the darker applications of magic, and they yielded to his ministrations like locks opening before a master key. The artifacts themselves seemed to recognize their rightful owner, settling into his hands with a weight that spoke not just of gold and gems, but of centuries of accumulated power and significance. But even as he claimed his prizes, Tom was implementing the final phase of his plan, the systematic modification of memories that would ensure his crime remained undiscovered. Hepzibah's house elf, that pathetic creature whose devotion to her mistress had made her the perfect witness to frame, found her recollections altered to include images of herself adding poison to her mistress's tea in a fit of confused malevolence. The modifications were so subtle and complete that the elf herself would never doubt her guilt, would confess to authorities with the broken-hearted sincerity of someone who genuinely believed herself responsible for her beloved mistress's death. The creation of his third Horcrux from Hepzibah's murder followed the same dark rituals that had bound his previous soul fragments to their chosen vessels, but the process was becoming almost routine in its terrible familiarity. His soul, already twice fractured, seemed to split more easily with each subsequent murder, as if the act of division had created fracture lines that made further breaking inevitable. The cup absorbed the soul fragment with an eagerness that spoke of its own dark history, the badgers carved into its surface seeming to writhe with malevolent life as the binding took hold. The significance of using Hufflepuff's cup as a Horcrux went beyond mere possession of a founder's artifact. It was a deliberate corruption of everything that Helga Hufflepuff had represented during her lifetime, where she had valued loyalty, hard work, and the inherent worth of all magical beings regardless of their blood status. Tom had chosen her artifact to house a fragment of his soul that had been created through the murder of one of her descendants. It was a violation that transcended the physical, a spiritual corruption that transformed an object of nurture and acceptance into a repository for the darkest evil the wizarding world had ever known. The months that followed Hepzibah's death were a period of intense activity as Tom worked to establish the networks and resources that would support his long-term goals. The cup was hidden with the same careful attention to security and symbolism that had characterized his previous Horcrux concealments, placed in a location that combined physical protection with psychological significance in ways that would make its discovery and destruction as unlikely as possible. But the locket presented different challenges and opportunities, its connection to his personal heritage making it both more precious and more dangerous to hide. The decision to create a fourth Horcrux in Slytherin's locket was driven by considerations that went beyond mere magical utility. This artifact represented his direct connection to the founder whose legacy he had claimed, the physical embodiment of his right to rule over the magical world according to Slytherin's vision of pure-blood supremacy. To house a fragment of his soul within such a vessel was to create a bond between himself and his ancestor that transcended normal inheritance, a magical connection that would persist as long as the Horcrux remained intact. But the murder required to create this fourth soul fragment presented unique challenges that tested even Tom's considerable skills in planning and execution. Unlike his previous victims, who had been chosen for their accessibility and the symbolic significance of their deaths, his fourth murder needed to be someone whose death would serve multiple purposes while remaining completely untraceable to him. The solution he eventually devised was both elegant and horrifying in its casual dismissal of human life as nothing more than a resource to be consumed in pursuit of greater goals. The Muggle he selected was chosen not for any personal significance but for his complete insignificance, a vagrant whose disappearance would attract no attention from authorities and whose death would leave no magical traces that could be followed by investigators. It was murder reduced to its most fundamental level, the taking of life for no purpose, beyond the mechanical requirements of soul-splitting, without even the emotional satisfaction that had accompanied his previous killings. The act itself was swift and unremarkable, a killing curse cast in a darkened alley that snuffed out a life as casually as one might extinguish a candle. The creation of the fourth Horcrux in Slytherin's locket was perhaps the most emotionally significant of all Tom's soul-splitting rituals, not because of the murder that enabled it, but because of what the completed artifact represented. This was more than just another anchor to prevent his death. It was the transformation of his family's greatest treasure into a guardian of his immortality, a fusion of heritage and ambition that elevated him beyond the limitations of his blood and birth. The locket that his mother had sold in desperation was now reclaimed by her son and elevated to serve purposes that she could never have imagined. But even as Tom celebrated the completion of his fourth Horcrux, he was aware that his activities were beginning to attract attention from sources that could pose genuine threats to his long-term security. The Ministry's Aurora Department had begun investigating the unusual cluster of deaths and disappearances that had accompanied his artifact acquisitions, while certain members of the Wizengamot were expressing concerns about the increase in dark arts activity that seemed to coincide with his movements through magical society. The time was approaching when Tom Riddle would need to disappear from public view, to shed his current identity, and begin the transformation into the figure who would one day be known as Lord Voldemort. The decision to vanish from the wizarding world was not made lightly, as it meant abandoning the comfortable identity he had spent years building and the networks he had carefully cultivated during his time at Borgin and Berks. But Tom understood that true power required sacrifice, and the sacrifice of his current life was a small price to pay for the opportunity to return as something far more terrible and far more powerful than anyone could imagine. The young man who had charmed his way into the private collections of Britain's oldest wizarding families would disappear forever, replaced by a dark legend whose very name would become synonymous with fear and death. The final weeks of his employment at Borgin and Berks were spent in careful preparation for the transformation that lay ahead. He arranged for the secure storage of his completed Horcruxes ensuring that they would remain hidden and protected during the years of exile and growth that would be required before he was ready to reveal himself to the world. The cup and locket joined the diary and ring in locations chosen for their security and significance, each one protected by spells and curses that would challenge even the most skilled wizards who might someday seek to destroy them. But perhaps the most important preparation was psychological rather than practical. The systematic suppression of whatever remained of Tom Riddle's original personality in favor of the darker consciousness that had been growing. With each act of murder and soul-splitting, the charming young man who had won the trust of lonely widows and impressed his employers with his knowledge and discretion was being gradually consumed by something that bore no resemblance to normal human consciousness. What was emerging was pure will-given form, ambition unconstrained by empathy or conscience, intelligence devoted entirely to the pursuit of power and the domination of others. The transformation was irreversible now, the point of no return long since past. 4 pieces of his soul had been torn away and hidden throughout magical Britain. 4 anchors that would prevent his death but had also prevented him from remaining fully human. Tom Riddle was dying by degrees, murdered by his own ambition, and replaced by something that would eventually become the most feared dark wizard in history. The boy who had once yearned for belonging and acceptance was gone forever, sacrificed on the altar of immortality and reborn as a monster whose very existence would reshape the magical world according to his vision of supremacy and terror. The cup and locket that had once graced the collection of a lonely widow now served purposes that their original creators could never have imagined, transformed from symbols of the founder's noble ideals into repositories for evil so profound that their very presence corrupted the spaces around them. They were proof of Tom's growing power and evidence of his willingness to violate every principle that civilized society held sacred in pursuit of his ultimate goals. 4 Horcruxes now existed in the world, 4 fragments of a soul that had chosen immortality over humanity and power over peace. 3 more remained to be created before Tom's vision would be complete. 3 more murders that would finish the work of transforming him from a brilliant student into the darkest wizard who had ever lived. The years that followed Tom Riddle's disappearance from the respectable corridors of magical commerce were shrouded in mystery that would fuel speculation for decades to come. Whispers of a brilliant young man who had simply vanished from sight like morning mist before the rising sun. But those who understood the deeper currents of magical society knew that such disappearances rarely indicated retreat or surrender, but rather preparation for something far more significant and dangerous. Tom had not abandoned his ambitions, but had merely withdrawn to pursue them beyond the reach of observation and interference, like a serpent shedding its skin in preparation for growth that would make its previous form seem insignificant by comparison. The quest that consumed his hidden years was the pursuit of artifacts that existed more in legend than in recorded history, treasures whose very existence was disputed by scholars who preferred the comfort of documented facts to the unsettling possibilities suggested by persistent myths and whispered stories. Chief among these legendary objects was Rowena Ravenclaw's diadem, that fabled circlet of wisdom that had supposedly enhanced the intelligence of its wearer to supernatural levels before vanishing from human knowledge centuries earlier. For Tom, whose intellect was already formidable enough to intimidate even his most brilliant contemporaries, the prospect of augmenting his mental capabilities through magical means represented an opportunity too valuable to ignore. But the diadem's greatest appeal lay not in its alleged powers, but in what its possession would represent: the completion of a collection that would establish him as the rightful heir to all 4 founders of Hogwarts, the wizard whose vision and ambition had proven worthy of their combined legacy. He already possessed artifacts from Slytherin and Hufflepuff, with plans to acquire something significant from Gryffindor when circumstances permitted. The addition of Ravenclaw's diadem would create a set of founder artifacts unmatched in magical history, a tangible symbol of his transcendence beyond the limitations that constrained ordinary wizards. The research required to locate the diadem drew upon every skill Tom had developed during his years of scholarly pursuit and practical investigation. Ancient texts yielded fragments of information that had to be pieced together like a puzzle whose picture remained tantalizingly incomplete. Family histories provided genealogical connections that might lead to descendants who possessed inherited memories or artifacts. Archaeological records suggested locations where the diadem might have been hidden or lost during the turbulent centuries since its disappearance from Ravenclaw Tower. But the breakthrough that would ultimately lead him to his prize came not from dusty volumes or crumbling parchments, but from a source far more immediate and accessible: the ghosts who haunted Hogwarts itself, those spectral remnants of lives that had been so intimately connected to the school that death itself could not sever their bonds. During his student years, Tom had cultivated relationships with these ethereal beings, not out of genuine interest in their stories, but because he understood that they possessed knowledge that had been accumulated over centuries of observation and memory. Helena Ravenclaw, known to students as the Grey Lady, had always been the most elusive and mysterious of Hogwarts' resident spirits. Her appearances rare, and her communications cryptic, even by ghostly standards. Unlike the other house ghosts who took obvious pleasure in their connections to the living world, Helena seemed to exist in a state of perpetual melancholy that suggested unresolved guilt or regret from her mortal existence. It was this emotional vulnerability that Tom had identified as the key to unlocking secrets that she had guarded for nearly 1,000 years. The approach he used to win Helena's confidence was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation that drew upon every technique he had learned for reading and exploiting the deepest needs of his targets. Rather than attempting to charm her with the superficial pleasantries that had proven so effective with living victims, Tom presented himself as a fellow scholar whose genuine appreciation for knowledge and learning had led him to seek her guidance in understanding the intellectual legacy that her mother had established at Hogwarts. The conversations that followed were conducted over months of patient cultivation, each encounter carefully orchestrated to deepen Helena's trust, while gradually leading their discussions toward the subjects that truly interested him. Tom demonstrated a knowledge of Ravenclaw history that impressed even its founder's daughter, his questions revealing an understanding of magical theory and educational philosophy that elevated their exchanges beyond casual curiosity to serious academic discourse. Helena, starved for intellectual companionship after centuries of isolation among people who saw her only as a curiosity or source of house pride, began to look forward to these conversations with an intensity that she had not felt since her mortal lifetime. But beneath Tom's scholarly facade lay calculations of ruthless precision as he studied Helena's responses and emotional reactions for clues about the secrets she carried. Her guilt was obvious to anyone trained in reading human nature, manifesting in subtle changes of expression and tone whenever their conversations touched upon certain subjects. The pattern that emerged suggested shame connected to her relationship with her mother, regret about actions taken or opportunities missed during her lifetime, and most significantly, knowledge of something that she believed she should have protected but had somehow failed to preserve. The revelation, when it finally came during a conversation conducted in the quiet hours after midnight when the castle slept around them, exceeded even Tom's considerable expectations for what Helena might reveal. The Grey Lady's confession emerged slowly and painfully, each word carrying the weight of centuries of accumulated guilt and self-recrimination that had bound her spirit to the castle as surely as any magical chain. The diadem had not been lost through accident or misfortune, but had been stolen by Helena herself during her mortal lifetime, taken from her mother in a moment of jealous rage that she had spent nearly 1,000 years regretting. The theft had been motivated not by greed or malice, but by the desperate need of a brilliant young woman to prove herself worthy of her legendary mother's legacy, to demonstrate that she possessed intellectual gifts that deserved recognition and respect, rather than dismissal as pale reflections of Ravenclaw genius. But the theft had accomplished nothing except the destruction of Helena's relationship with the mother she had sought to impress, leading to a confrontation that had ended with Helena's flight from Scotland and her eventual death in a distant land, alone and unreconciled with the woman whose approval she had craved above all else. The diadem had been hidden during that flight, buried in a place where Helena believed it would never be found and where her crime would remain concealed forever. The location she revealed to Tom was both specific and romantically tragic: a hollow tree in an Albanian forest, marked by distinctive rock formations that had served as landmarks for travelers since ancient times. Helena had chosen the spot not for its security but for its isolation, believing that the diadem would be safer in a forgotten wilderness than in any location where human ambition might lead to its eventual discovery. She had hidden it there and died shortly afterward, taking the secret to her grave and beyond, carrying the burden of her theft through centuries of ghostly existence. The journey to Albania that Tom undertook in the depths of winter was both pilgrimage and conquest, a quest that would establish him as the most successful treasure hunter in magical history, while providing him with the artifact needed to complete his collection of founder relics. The forest Helena had described was a wilderness of such primal darkness that it seemed untouched by human presence, its ancient trees standing like sentinels guarding secrets that predated recorded history. The search for the specific tree Helena had described required weeks of patient exploration through terrain that challenged even Tom's considerable survival skills. The landmarks she had mentioned had been altered by centuries of natural growth and weather, forcing him to rely on magical detection methods and intuitive understanding of how a frightened young woman might have chosen a hiding place during a moment of desperate panic. But his persistence was rewarded when he finally located the hollow tree, its interior still concealing the wrapped bundle that Helena had placed there nearly 1,000 years earlier. The diadem itself was a masterwork of medieval craftsmanship that seemed to glow with inner light even after centuries of concealment in darkness. The sapphires set into its silver circlet caught and reflected the wan winter sunlight with an intensity that spoke of magical enhancement, while the inscribed words around its band proclaimed the wisdom that had been Rowena Ravenclaw's greatest gift to the magical world. To hold such an artifact was to connect directly with one of the founders of Hogwarts, to possess a tangible piece of the school's most sacred history. But for Tom, the diadem's historical significance was secondary to its utility as a vessel for another fragment of his increasingly fractured soul. The murder required to create his fifth Horcrux was accomplished with the same casual efficiency that had characterized his disposal of the vagrant in London, another meaningless death that served only to provide the trauma necessary for soul-splitting. An Albanian peasant whose name Tom never learned and whose life had apparently held so little value that no one would ever investigate his disappearance, became the sacrifice that transformed Ravenclaw's diadem from a symbol of wisdom into a repository for evil. The ritual of Horcrux creation had become almost routine by this point in Tom's dark career, the familiar agony of soul-splitting no longer capable of surprising him with its intensity. His consciousness had adapted to the process of division, accepting the pain and disorientation as necessary costs of achieving immortality. But with each successful binding of a soul fragment to its chosen vessel, he could feel himself becoming less human and more something else entirely, a creature whose connection to normal human experience was fading like colors in a painting exposed to too much sunlight. The hiding place Tom chose for the diadem reflected both strategic thinking and psychological symbolism in ways that revealed his complex relationship with his Hogwarts heritage. Rather than concealing it in some remote location where discovery would be virtually impossible, he decided to return the artifact to the school itself, to hide it in plain sight, among the very stones where it had been created and where its power would be strongest. The decision was driven partly by arrogance, the belief that he could conceal something within Hogwarts better than the founders themselves had protected their treasures, and partly by a deeper need to maintain his connection to the place that had been his true home. The Room of Requirement provided the perfect hiding place, that mysterious chamber whose very existence was known to few and understood by even fewer. Tom had discovered the room during his student years through the same methodical exploration that had revealed so many of Hogwarts' secrets, but he had kept the knowledge to himself rather than sharing it with teachers or fellow students who might have found uses for such a space. Now it would serve as the ultimate vault, a place that could hide his Horcrux among thousands of other objects while remaining accessible only to those who knew the specific requirements needed to reveal its treasures. The chamber that appeared when Tom requested a place to hide something was vast beyond normal architectural possibility, filled with accumulated debris from centuries of Hogwarts history. Students and teachers had used this space to conceal evidence of rule breaking, to store broken furniture and damaged equipment, to hide gifts and letters and personal possessions that they could not keep in their regular quarters. The result was a labyrinth of forgotten items that stretched beyond the reach of torchlight, creating perfect camouflage for one more addition to the vast collection. Tom placed the diadem with ceremonial care upon the head of a statue that seemed to have been carved to commemorate some long-forgotten wizard, its features worn smooth by age, and its original identity lost to time. The positioning was both practical and poetic. Hidden among countless other objects, yet elevated to a place of honor that reflected its true significance, concealed from casual discovery, yet accessible to anyone who understood the symbolic importance of what they sought. But even as Tom celebrated the successful creation and concealment of his fifth Horcrux, he was beginning to recognize patterns in his own behavior that suggested the soul splitting was affecting him in ways that went beyond the expected loss of humanity. The murders that had once provided emotional satisfaction through their connection to personal revenge or ideological purpose were becoming mechanical acts performed solely for their utility in Horcrux creation. The careful selection of victims based on symbolic significance was giving way to pragmatic choices based purely on opportunity and convenience. The Albanian peasant whose death had enabled the diadem Horcrux represented the ultimate expression of this degradation. A human life ended not because of any personal significance or ideological meaning, but simply because a murder was required, and he happened to be available. It was killing reduced to its most fundamental level, the taking of life as a purely mechanical process that served no purpose beyond the creation of magical artifacts. The act had required no planning, generated no emotional response, left no lasting impression beyond the functional result it had achieved. This mechanical approach to murder reflected deeper changes in Tom's psychological makeup that were becoming more pronounced with each act of soul-splitting. The capacity for emotional connection that had once allowed him to manipulate others through understanding their needs and desires was fading, replaced by a cold calculation that saw people purely as resources to be exploited or obstacles to be eliminated. Love, hatred, fear, joy. These were becoming abstract concepts that he could recognize intellectually but no longer experience personally. But if his humanity was dying by degrees, his magical abilities were growing stronger with each Horcrux created. The fragments of soul bound to physical objects seemed to create a network of power that enhanced his capabilities beyond what should have been possible for any individual wizard. Spells came more easily, required less effort, achieved effects that pushed the boundaries of what conventional magical theory suggested was possible. He was becoming something beyond normal human limitations, a being whose very existence challenged the natural order that governed mortal life and death. The isolation that accompanied this transformation was both chosen and inevitable, as Tom found himself increasingly unable to maintain the facades that had once allowed him to move comfortably through wizarding society. The charm that had been his greatest tool in manipulation required emotional understanding that he no longer possessed, while the patience needed for long-term social cultivation was being eroded by growing impatience with the limitations and stupidity of others. He was becoming something that could not easily hide among normal people, whose very presence would mark him as different and dangerous to anyone with sufficient sensitivity to magical auras. The decision to continue his exile rather than return to Britain was driven by recognition that his transformation was not yet complete, and that premature revelation would compromise the grand design he had spent so many years developing. 5 Horcruxes now existed, 5 anchors that would prevent his death, even if his body was destroyed. But 2 more were needed to achieve the perfect number that would make his immortality truly secure. The murders required to create those final soul fragments would have to be chosen with particular care, as they would complete the process of transformation that had begun with Myrtle's death in the Chamber of Secrets. But beyond the practical considerations of Horcrux creation lay questions about his ultimate goals and methods that were becoming increasingly urgent as his power grew and his humanity diminished. The young man who had once dreamed of ruling the wizarding world through political influence and social manipulation was evolving into something that could achieve dominance only through fear and force, whose very nature would make peaceful coexistence with ordinary wizards impossible. The vision that sustained him during these years of exile and preparation was one of ultimate triumph achieved through methods that grew more terrible as they became more clearly defined. He would return to Britain not as Tom Riddle seeking conventional power, but as something far more dangerous and far more effective, a Dark Lord whose very existence would reshape magical society according to his vision of purity, strength. The murders, the Horcruxes, the systematic destruction of his own humanity were all steps toward that ultimate goal, prices paid in advance for achievements that would dwarf anything accomplished by previous dark wizards. The artifacts he had collected, diary, ring, cup, locket, and now diadem, were more than mere repositories for fragments of his soul, but symbols of his transcendence beyond normal human limitations. Each one represented not just protection from death, but a step toward the godlike existence that was his ultimate ambition, the transformation of Tom Riddle from brilliant student into immortal ruler, whose power would be constrained only by the scope of his vision and the extent of his will. As the Albanian winter deepened around his hidden retreat, Tom reflected on how much he had accomplished and how much remained to be done. 5 pieces of his soul were now hidden throughout the world, 5 anchors that would prevent his destruction, even if enemies somehow managed to overcome his defenses and destroy his body. But the final phase of his transformation still awaited, the completion of the process that would establish him as the most powerful dark wizard in history, and set the stage for achievements that would echo through the centuries, long after lesser wizards had been forgotten. The diadem that now rested in its hiding place within Hogwarts was proof of his ability to succeed where others had failed, to claim treasures that had been lost to history and bend them to serve purposes their creators had never imagined. It was a masterpiece of strategic planning and magical application that demonstrated his worthiness to inherit the legacy of all four founders, his capacity to surpass their individual achievements through the systematic pursuit of power and immortality. But more than any single accomplishment, the successful creation and concealment of his fifth Horcrux marked Tom's complete transformation from the categories and limitations that had once defined his existence. He was no longer fully human, no longer entirely mortal, no longer bound by the constraints that governed ordinary magical beings. He was becoming Lord Voldemort in truth as well as name, a creature of such power and malevolence that his eventual return to Britain would herald the beginning of an age of darkness that would challenge everything the wizarding world believed about the nature of good and evil, life and death, the possible and the impossible. The years of exile that had transformed Tom Riddle into something approaching a force of nature rather than a mere mortal wizard had also taught him the fundamental truth that power without security was merely potential waiting to be destroyed by enemies or circumstance. 5 Horcruxes now existed in the world, 5 fragments of his soul that guaranteed his survival even if his body was utterly annihilated, but their creation was only half the equation that would ensure his immortality. The artifacts that contained his essence needed to be hidden with the same meticulous care that had gone into their creation, placed in locations where they would remain safe, not just for years or decades, but for centuries of potential conflict and discovery. The strategic considerations that governed the placement of his soul fragments were as complex as any military campaign, requiring him to think not just as a wizard protecting treasures, but as a general positioning assets for a war that might last generations. Each hiding place needed to be secure against magical detection and physical intrusion, yet accessible enough that he could retrieve the Horcruxes if circumstances required their relocation. More importantly, the locations needed to be psychologically significant in ways that would make their discovery and destruction as unlikely as possible, protected not just by spells and curses, but by the emotional and symbolic weight that would deter even determined enemies from pursuing them to their ultimate conclusions. The Gaunt ring, his second Horcrux, and the artifact most intimately connected to his family heritage, demanded a hiding place that reflected both its personal significance and the contempt he felt for the weakness that had allowed his mother's family to decline from greatness into squalor. The ruins of the Gaunt shack, abandoned since Morphin's arrest and conviction for murders that Tom had committed, provided the perfect combination of symbolic appropriateness and practical concealment. Here, among the decaying remnants of his maternal bloodline, the ring would be protected by obscurity and defended by magical traps that would turn the hovel into a death trap for anyone foolish enough to disturb its rest. The protective enchantments that Tom wove around the hidden ring were masterworks of defensive magic that drew upon knowledge gleaned from the darkest corners of forbidden learning. The primary defense was elegantly simple in concept, but devastating in execution, a curse that would activate the moment someone placed the ring upon their finger, promising to fulfill their deepest desires while slowly draining their life force until death became inevitable. It was a trap that played upon the fundamental weakness of human nature, the inability to resist temptations that seemed to offer everything they had ever wanted. But Tom understood that even the most powerful individual curse might be overcome by a wizard of sufficient skill and knowledge, so he layered additional protections around the ring like the petals of a poisonous flower, detection charms that would alert him instantly if the hiding place was disturbed, tracking spells that would follow intruders through their magical signatures no matter how far they fled, jinxes that would multiply and intensify with each attempt to dispel them, until the very act of trying to remove the curses became more dangerous than leaving them undisturbed. The concealment itself was a work of art that spoke to Tom's growing mastery of magic that operated on levels beyond normal wizarding understanding. The ring was not simply buried in the ruins, but was integrated into the very fabric of the shack's magical signature, becoming part of the structure's essence in ways that made detection nearly impossible, even for wizards specifically searching for hidden objects. Only someone who understood the precise nature of what they were looking for and the exact methods Tom had used to hide it would have any chance of locating the Horcrux among the competing magical emanations that filled the abandoned building. But it was Slytherin's locket that received the most elaborate protection of all Tom's Horcruxes, reflecting both its immense personal significance and its connection to the founder whose legacy he had claimed as his own. This artifact deserved security that went beyond mere concealment, defenses that would challenge even the most skilled and determined enemies while creating layers of protection so complex that their very existence would discourage all but the most desperate attempts at retrieval. The location Tom chose for the locket was a cave that held profound psychological significance from his childhood years at Wool's orphanage, a dark recess in the coastal cliffs where he had first discovered his ability to cause pain and terror in other children through the application of magical forces he did not yet understand. The cave had been the site of his earliest experiments in dominance and cruelty, the place where two fellow orphans had been so traumatized by his attentions that they had never fully recovered their sanity or their ability to function normally in human society. Others had descended into systematic violence and destruction that made Rick's own multiversal killing spree seem restrained and purposeful by comparison, using their technological capabilities to inflict suffering on entire civilizations as outlets for psychological pain that could not be processed or resolved through normal therapeutic approaches. Rick's growing realization of his dependency on Morty was accompanied by uncomfortable recognition that his grandson served functions in his psychological economy that went far beyond simple companionship or adventure partnership, providing him with motivation for continued existence and engagement with reality that had been completely absent during his years of multiversal exile and systematic revenge against alternate versions of himself. The boy's innocence and emotional vulnerability had given Rick's life structure and meaning that transcended his personal quest for vengeance, while also providing him with opportunities to experience protective love and mentorship that reconnected him to aspects of his personality that had been buried beneath decades of trauma and moral compromise. The panic that Rick experienced as Morty's absence stretched into its second day was not simply concern for his grandson's physical safety, but existential terror about the possibility that he might be forced to return to the kind of isolated existence that had characterized his life before finding his replacement family, when his only sources of motivation had been hatred and the systematic pursuit of goals that provided temporary distraction from questions about meaning and purpose that his superior intelligence could not adequately address. The recognition that his emotional stability had become dependent on relationships that could be lost through circumstances beyond his control created anxiety that no amount of technological capability or strategic planning could eliminate entirely. Beth's response to Morty's disappearance revealed her own growing maturity and emotional sophistication as she took charge of coordinating search efforts while also providing support and reassurance for other family members whose anxiety and fear threatened to overwhelm their capacity for effective action and clear thinking. Establish him as the most powerful dark wizard. The final protection was perhaps the most insidious of all. Tom's decision to test his defenses using a living subject whose suffering would validate the effectiveness of his creation while providing additional security for the Horcrux creature the house elf belonging to Regulus Black, had been borrowed under false pretenses and forced to endure every trap and obstacle that guarded the locket's hiding place. The creature's ordeal served multiple purposes. It confirmed that the cave's defenses would function as intended. It provided Tom with detailed knowledge of how intruders would experience each stage of the infiltration, and it left behind a witness whose magical nature allowed him to escape, but whose testimony would never be believed by those who might otherwise investigate the cave's secrets. The cruelty of using Regulus Black's devoted house elf as an unwilling test subject revealed the complete absence of empathy that had accompanied Tom's transformation into Lord Voldemort. Creature's screams as he was forced to drink the potion meant nothing more to Tom than the sounds of wind or water, evidence that his defenses were functioning properly, rather than the agonized cries of a sentient being subjected to torture for no greater purpose than satisfying one wizard's paranoid need for security. But if the locket received the most elaborate defenses, Ravenclaw's diadem was protected by perhaps the most ingenious concealment of all Tom's Horcruxes. Rather than hiding it in some remote location where discovery would depend purely on chance, he had chosen to place it within Hogwarts itself, concealed among the accumulated debris of centuries while remaining accessible to him whenever circumstances might require its retrieval. The Room of Requirement provided perfect camouflage for the artifact, hiding it among thousands of other discarded objects, while ensuring that only someone who knew exactly what they were seeking would have any hope of locating it. The positioning of the diadem was itself a work of psychological artistry that revealed Tom's complex relationship with his Hogwarts heritage. He had placed it upon the head of a stone statue that might have been intended to honor some long-forgotten wizard, elevating the artifact to a place of honor, while simultaneously mocking the very concept of memorializing the dead. The diadem that had once symbolized Rowena Ravenclaw's wisdom was now transformed into a crown for an anonymous figure whose identity had been lost to time, a fitting metaphor for how Tom viewed the entire wizarding establishment that claimed to honor the founders while failing to understand their true significance. The diary that had been his first Horcrux presented unique challenges and opportunities that set it apart from his other soul fragments. Unlike the artifacts that were meant to remain hidden until the end of time, the diary was designed to serve as both protection and weapon, a tool that could advance his goals even during periods when his own body might be destroyed or incapacitated. This dual nature required a different approach to security, one that balanced accessibility with protection, in ways that would allow the diary to function as intended, while minimizing the risk of its premature discovery and destruction. Tom's decision to entrust the diary to Lucius Malfoy reflected both tactical calculation and psychological manipulation that demonstrated his growing skill in managing the followers who would form the foundation of his eventual return to power. Malfoy represented the epitome of pure-blood privilege and political influence, a wizard whose family connections and financial resources made him valuable as an ally, while his moral flexibility made him controllable through a combination of fear and shared ideology. But more than mere utility, Tom's choice of Malfoy as guardian for his first Horcrux was a test of loyalty that would reveal the depth of commitment he could expect from his followers when truly critical decisions needed to be made. The diary was presented not as a priceless artifact containing a fragment of his master's soul, but as a weapon of terror that could be deployed against enemies when circumstances made such action advantageous. Malfoy's willingness to accept custody of such a dangerous object demonstrated his value as a Death Eater, while his ignorance of its true nature ensured that he would treat it as expendable rather than irreplaceable. The instructions Tom provided for the diary's use were deliberately vague, allowing Malfoy to exercise his own judgment about when and how to deploy it, while ensuring that its activation would serve the larger goals of creating fear and chaos within the wizarding community. The artifact's ability to possess and control whoever formed an emotional connection with it made it ideal for striking at enemies through their children or loved ones, turning the very bonds of affection that Tom himself could no longer feel into weapons that could destroy families from within. Hufflepuff's cup presented different challenges that reflected both its historical significance and Tom's growing network of devoted followers who could provide security through their own resources and connections. Bellatrix Lestrange represented the most fanatically loyal of all his Death Eaters, a witch whose devotion to his cause had transcended normal human emotion to become a form of religious obsession that made her completely trustworthy in matters involving his personal security. The Lestrange family vault in Gringotts Wizarding Bank provided security that went far beyond what any individual wizard could achieve through personal effort, protected by the accumulated defenses that the Goblin-run institution had developed over centuries of safeguarding the treasures of Wizarding Society's most prominent families. The vault itself was accessible only through magical keys that were held exclusively by family members, while its contents were protected by curses and creatures that would challenge even the most skilled thieves who somehow managed to penetrate the bank's outer defenses. But Tom's decision to hide the cup in such a well-protected location also revealed his growing confidence in his ability to manipulate and control the institutions of Wizarding Society from within. Gringotts represented the ultimate symbol of magical capitalism and pure-blood privilege. Its vaults filled with treasures that had been accumulated through centuries of careful inheritance and strategic alliance. By placing his Horcrux within such an establishment, Tom was demonstrating his belief that even the most sacred institutions could be corrupted and turned to serve his purposes when the time came for his return to power. The psychological impact of these hiding places extended far beyond their practical function as storage locations for his soul fragments. Each chosen site represented a violation of something that normal Wizarding Society held sacred: family heritage, in the case of the Gaunt Shack, childhood innocence in the seaside cave, educational tradition in the Room of Requirement, political authority in Malfoy Manor, and financial security in the Gringotts Vault. Tom was systematically contaminating the foundations of magical civilization with his presence, ensuring that his influence would spread like a virus through the very institutions that claimed to oppose his vision of wizarding supremacy. But perhaps the most significant aspect of his hiding strategy was the way it reflected his evolving understanding of power and its application in pursuit of ultimate goals. The young Tom Riddle who had begun this journey might have been content to hide his Horcruxes in remote locations where they would remain undisturbed indefinitely, but the creature he was becoming understood that true immortality required more than mere survival. It demanded the ability to influence events and shape outcomes even when his physical form was absent or destroyed, to ensure that his vision would continue to advance, regardless of temporary setbacks or apparent defeats. The network of hidden Horcruxes that Tom had created was more than a collection of magical artifacts designed to prevent his death. It was a web of influence that extended throughout Wizarding Britain, connecting him to locations and institutions and individuals who would serve his purposes whether they understood their role or not. Each hiding place was a node in a larger pattern that would allow him to maintain his presence and power, even during periods of apparent absence or defeat, ensuring that Lord Voldemort would never truly be gone, as long as a single fragment of his soul remained intact. The completion of this phase of his grand design left Tom with a satisfaction that transcended normal human emotion, a cold pleasure that came from the successful execution of plans whose complexity and audacity exceeded anything attempted by previous dark wizards. 5 Horcruxes were now hidden throughout magical Britain, protected by defenses that combined physical obstacles with psychological manipulation and magical innovation in ways that would challenge even the most skilled and determined enemies. But even as he celebrated this achievement, Tom was already beginning to plan the final phase of his transformation, the creation of 2 additional Horcruxes that would complete his collection and establish him as the most powerful immortal being in wizarding history. The murders required for these final soul fragments would need to be chosen with particular care, as they would represent not just steps toward immortality, but symbolic statements about his vision for the future of magical society. The boy who had once feared death above all else was evolving into something that transcended mortal limitations entirely, a creature whose very existence challenged the natural order that governed life and death, creation and destruction, good and evil. The hiding of his Horcruxes marked the end of his vulnerability and the beginning of an immortal existence that would allow him unlimited time to pursue the reshaping of the wizarding world according to his vision of purity and power. The network of protection he had established around his soul fragments represented more than defensive strategy. It was a manifestation of his will made physical, a way of ensuring that his influence would persist and grow regardless of what happened to his individual body. Tom Riddle was becoming truly immortal, but the price of that immortality was the systematic destruction of everything that had once made him human. The hiding places of his Horcruxes were also the burial sites of his former self, markers of a transformation so profound that return to his original nature was no longer possible, even if he had desired such regression. The game was now set, the pieces positioned, the defenses established. Lord Voldemort was ready to begin his conquest of the wizarding world, secure in the knowledge that death itself could not prevent his ultimate victory. The hidden Horcruxes would serve as his foundation and his fortress, ensuring that even the most catastrophic defeat would be merely temporary setback rather than final ending. The greatest dark wizard in history had achieved true immortality, and the price of that achievement would be paid not by him but by everyone who stood in the path of his inexorable rise to absolute power. The prophecy that would reshape the destiny of the wizarding world came to Sybil Trelawney on a night when winter winds howled through the streets of magical London, like the voices of ancient spirits bearing warnings that mortals were not meant to hear. The words that emerged from her lips in that dingy upstairs room of the Hogshead Inn carried the weight of fate itself, speaking of a child born at the end of July who would possess the power to vanquish the Dark Lord, who had risen to terrorize magical Britain with unprecedented cruelty and ambition. Lord Voldemort, as Tom Riddle had finally chosen to be known throughout the wizarding world, had spent the intervening years since his disappearance from Borgin and Berks building an organization of followers whose loyalty was secured through a combination of ideological fervor and mortal terror. The Death Eaters who served him were drawn from the highest echelons of pure-blood society, wizards and witches whose family names appeared in the most exclusive social registers, but whose hearts had been corrupted by promises of power and threats of destruction that made resistance seem not just futile, but suicidal. The war that had consumed magical Britain for years was unlike anything in recorded wizarding history, characterized not by the grand battles and heroic confrontations that marked traditional conflicts, but by a campaign of systematic terror that struck at the very foundations of civilized society. Families disappeared from their homes in the middle of the night, leaving behind only the dark mark burning in the sky above empty houses where children's toys lay abandoned and meals grew cold on tables that would never again host family gatherings. But it was the prophecy that transformed Voldemort's methodical conquest from mere political ambition into personal obsession that consumed every aspect of his increasingly inhuman consciousness. The notion that a child yet unborn could possess the power to destroy him was so fundamentally threatening to his vision of eternal dominance that it demanded immediate and absolute response. The boy described in Trelawney's words would not be allowed to grow into the threat he represented, but would instead be eliminated before he could develop whatever mysterious power the prophecy attributed to him. The investigation that followed the prophecy's revelation was conducted with the same meticulous attention to detail that had characterized all of Voldemort's major undertakings, drawing upon intelligence networks that extended throughout the Ministry of Magic and into the most secret corners of the wizarding world. The criteria described by the prophecy, a boy born to parents who had thrice defied the Dark Lord, delivered at the end of July, narrowed the field of potential candidates to a handful of families whose circumstances matched the ancient words that had been spoken in tones of mystical certainty. 2 names emerged from this investigation as the most likely subjects of the prophecy's warning: Harry Potter, son of James and Lily Potter, and Neville Longbottom, child of Frank and Alice Longbottom. Both families had indeed defied Voldemort on 3 separate occasions. Both had produced sons in the final days of July, and both represented the kind of blood traitor families whose very existence challenged the pure blood supremacy that formed the ideological foundation of Voldemort's movement. The choice between these potential targets was made through considerations that revealed both Voldemort's tactical thinking and the psychological factors that continued to influence his decisions, despite the systematic destruction of his humanity through Horcrux creation. Harry Potter's parents were younger, less experienced, perhaps more vulnerable to the kind of assault that Voldemort planned to unleash upon whichever family he selected. But more significantly, Harry was a half-blood like Voldemort himself, making his potential power more personally threatening to someone who had spent his entire life struggling with the implications of his own mixed heritage. The decision to target the Potter family was also influenced by intelligence, suggesting that they were protected by powerful magic that would make their elimination a worthy test of Voldemort's abilities, while providing the kind of significant murder that he required for his ultimate Horcrux creation. The death of Harry Potter would serve multiple purposes. It would neutralize the prophetic threat. It would demonstrate Voldemort's power to overcome any magical protection, and it would provide the soul-splitting trauma necessary to create his 7th and final Horcrux from the murder of someone whose death carried genuine cosmic significance. The planning for what Voldemort intended to be his ultimate triumph required months of careful preparation that drew upon every resource and capability he had developed during his rise to power. The Potters were known to be hidden under the protection of the Fidelius charm, that most powerful of concealment magics that could hide not just a location, but the very knowledge of its existence from all but a chosen few. Breaking such protection would require either overwhelming magical force or the betrayal of someone who possessed the secret, and Voldemort had learned that betrayal was often more reliable than brute strength in achieving seemingly impossible goals. The corruption of Peter Pettigrew represented perhaps Voldemort's greatest achievement in the manipulation of human weakness and the exploitation of psychological vulnerability for tactical advantage. Pettigrew had been the weakest member of a group of friends whose loyalty to each other had been legendary during their Hogwarts years, the one most susceptible to fear and most likely to prioritize personal survival over abstract principles when faced with genuine mortal threat. The process of turning Pettigrew from devoted friend into willing betrayer required psychological techniques that went far beyond simple intimidation or bribery, involving the systematic destruction of the man's self-respect and moral foundation until cooperation with evil seemed not just acceptable, but inevitable. Voldemort understood that the most effective treachery came not from those who betrayed for personal gain, but from those who betrayed because they had been convinced that betrayal was their only realistic option for survival. But even as Voldemort prepared for what he expected to be a routine elimination of a potential threat, he was also planning for the symbolic significance that Harry Potter's death would carry within the larger context of his war against the established magical order. This would not be merely another murder, but a statement about the futility of resistance and the inevitability of his triumph over all who dared to oppose his vision of wizarding supremacy. The Horcrux he planned to create from Harry's death would be different from all his previous soul fragments, representing not just another anchor to prevent his own destruction, but the ultimate proof of his power over life and death itself. To split his soul through the murder of someone who was prophesied to be his equal would demonstrate his superiority over fate itself, his ability to reshape destiny according to his will, rather than accepting the limitations that prophecy sought to impose upon his ambitions. The location he had chosen for this final Horcrux was equally significant. Nagini, the great serpent who had become his most trusted companion, and the living embodiment of his connection to Salazar Slytherin's legacy. Unlike his previous Horcruxes, which were hidden in static objects that could be concealed and protected through conventional means, Nagini would be a mobile repository for his soul fragment, capable of defending herself while serving as his eyes and ears in situations where his own presence might be dangerous or inadvisable. The night of October 31st, 1981, would be remembered throughout the wizarding world as the moment when the seemingly unstoppable rise of Lord Voldemort met forces that had been set in motion by magic far older and more powerful than anything he had encountered in his years of conquest and terror. The cottage in Godric's Hollow, where the Potter family had hidden themselves, was modest and unremarkable from the outside, its appearance designed to blend seamlessly with the Muggle neighborhood that surrounded it. But beneath this facade of ordinary domesticity lay magical protections that had been woven with skill and dedication that matched anything Voldemort had created around his own Horcruxes. The love that bound the Potter family together had been transformed through ancient magic into a shield that could turn away even the most powerful curses, protection that grew stronger rather than weaker when tested by forces that sought to destroy what it guarded. James Potter's death came quickly and without ceremony, the killing curse that ended his life, cast almost casually by a Dark Lord, whose attention was focused entirely on the child who represented the prophetic threat to his immortal existence. There was no dramatic confrontation, no exchange of defiant words or heroic last stands, simply the green flash of Avada Kedavra and the collapse of a young father whose only crime had been loving his family enough to stand between them and the darkness that had come to claim them. But it was Lily Potter's sacrifice that would prove to be Voldemort's undoing, her choice to die in place of her infant son, activating magic so ancient and powerful that its very existence had been forgotten by most of the wizarding world. The protection she created through her death was not merely another charm or ward, but a fundamental alteration in the magical forces that surrounded Harry Potter, transforming the child into something that Voldemort's corrupted soul could not touch without suffering consequences that neither participant in the confrontation could have predicted. The killing curse that should have ended Harry Potter's life instead encountered protection that turned the spell back upon its caster with devastating effect. Voldemort, whose soul had been weakened and destabilized through the creation of 5 Horcruxes, found his own magic turned against him in ways that his theoretical knowledge had never suggested were possible. The green light that erupted from his wand struck not its intended target, but rebounded to strike the wizard who had cast it, shattering his body and scattering his consciousness like leaves before a hurricane. But the most significant consequence of that night was not Voldemort's apparent destruction, but the accidental creation of something that neither prophecy nor magical theory had predicted. A 6th Horcrux formed not through deliberate ritual, but through the traumatic splitting of a soul that had been pushed beyond the boundaries of stability through repeated acts of murder and magical violation. The fragment of Voldemort's consciousness that was torn away by the rebounding curse had nowhere to go except into the only living thing present in that devastated nursery, binding itself to Harry Potter in ways that would influence both their destinies for years to come. The child who survived that night carried within him not just the scar that marked his encounter with the killing curse, but a piece of the Dark Lord's own soul, making him simultaneously the prophesied destroyer and an unwitting guardian of his enemy's immortality. It was an irony so profound that it bordered on cosmic comedy, the ultimate expression of Voldemort's failure to understand that some forms of magic were more powerful than anything that could be achieved through the systematic violation of natural law. The consciousness that had once been Lord Voldemort found itself reduced to something less than spirit and more than memory, a fragment of will and malice that clung to existence through sheer refusal to accept the defeat that should have been final. His Horcruxes had served their intended purpose, preventing his complete destruction and maintaining the possibility of eventual return, but they could not restore the body that had been shattered by his own rebounded curse, or provide the magical energy needed to sustain anything resembling normal existence. The years that followed were a period of exile more complete and more terrible than anything Voldemort had experienced during his earlier periods of withdrawal from wizarding society. Without physical form, he was reduced to existing as a parasite that could survive only by possessing weaker beings whose life force could sustain his consciousness for limited periods. The mighty Dark Lord, who had terrorized magical Britain, was transformed into something pathetic and desperate, fleeing from place to place in search of hosts who could keep his fractured spirit from dissolving entirely into the void. The forests of Albania became his refuge, that wilderness where he had once claimed Ravenclaw's diadem, and where magical creatures primitive enough to serve as temporary vessels could be found in sufficient numbers to sustain his diminished existence. But even the strongest animals could support his presence for only brief periods before being consumed by the malevolent energy that his consciousness had become, forcing him into an endless cycle of possession and abandonment that left a trail of dead creatures in his wake. The irony of his situation was not lost on the remnant of intelligence that had once been Tom Riddle, the recognition that his quest for immortality had achieved precisely the opposite of what he had intended. Instead of transcending mortality to achieve godlike existence, he had reduced himself to something less than alive, trapped in a liminal state between life and death that offered neither the peace of the grave nor the possibilities of true existence. But perhaps the cruelest aspect of his condition was the knowledge that Harry Potter lived and thrived while carrying within him a fragment of the very soul that had tried to destroy him. The child who should have been his ultimate victim had instead become an unwitting guardian of his immortality, ensuring his survival while simultaneously representing everything that had gone wrong with his carefully planned conquest of the wizarding world. The magical resonance created by Harry's status as an accidental Horcrux established a connection between them that would persist until one or both was destroyed, a link that allowed each to experience echoes of the other's thoughts and emotions in ways that neither fully understood. For Harry, this connection would manifest as disturbing dreams and sudden insights into Voldemort's activities. For the Dark Lord's fragmented consciousness, it provided a tantalizing glimpse of the life and power that had been taken from him by forces he had never bothered to understand or respect. The protection that Lily Potter's sacrifice had created around her son proved to be more enduring and more comprehensive than anyone had imagined, extending beyond the physical immunity that had turned away the killing curse to encompass psychological and spiritual barriers that would influence Harry's development in ways both subtle and profound. The love that had been transformed into magic through her death continued to shield him from the corrupting influence of the soul fragment he carried, preventing the piece of Voldemort from taking control, or even making its presence clearly known to its unwilling host. This protection represented the antithesis of everything Voldemort believed about the nature of power and its proper application, demonstrating that magic based on love and sacrifice could be more powerful than anything achieved through hatred and domination. It was a lesson that his fractured consciousness was incapable of learning. So completely had his humanity been destroyed through the creation of Horcruxes and the pursuit of immortality at any cost. The wizarding world that emerged from the apparent defeat of Lord Voldemort was transformed by the trauma of the war, but also by the hope represented by Harry Potter's survival. The child who lived became a symbol of resistance to tyranny and proof that even the darkest magic could be overcome through courage and love. But few understood the true complexity of what had occurred in that ruined nursery. The way that victory and defeat had become intertwined in patterns that would take years to fully reveal themselves. The accidental Horcrux that resided within Harry Potter was perhaps the most significant unintended consequence of Voldemort's quest for immortality, representing both the failure of his plans and the seed of his eventual resurrection. The child who carried his soul fragment would grow up as the symbol of everything he opposed, while simultaneously serving as the guardian of his continued existence, a living paradox that ensured the conflict between them could never truly end until one completely destroyed the other. But for now, in those early days after the attack on Godric's Hollow, the wizarding world celebrated what appeared to be decisive victory over the forces of darkness, while remaining ignorant of the true price that had been paid for their salvation. Harry Potter slept peacefully in his crib, protected by magic he would not understand for many years, carrying within him a secret that would shape his destiny and determine the fate of everyone he would come to love. The Dark Lord was gone but not destroyed, reduced to less than spirit but not eliminated, his consciousness scattered across multiple anchors that ensured his survival while limiting his ability to influence events directly. The game of immortality that he had played so carefully was now beyond his control, its outcome dependent on forces and factors that his fractured soul could neither understand nor manipulate with his former skill. The boy who lived had become both his greatest enemy and his most essential ally. The child whose death he had sought now serving as the guardian of his continued existence in ways that neither could comprehend. It was the ultimate irony of a quest that had sought to transcend human limitations through the systematic destruction of human connections, only to find that survival itself depended upon the very bonds of love and sacrifice that had been dismissed as weakness by a mind too corrupted to recognize their true power. The exile that had reduced Lord Voldemort from the most feared dark wizard in history to a wraith-like consciousness clinging to existence through sheer malevolent will, stretched across nearly 13 years of desperate wandering through the darkest corners of the magical world. His fragmented soul, scattered and weakened by the catastrophic failure at Godric's Hollow, found temporary refuge in creatures whose primitive minds could sustain his presence without immediately being consumed by the corrosive nature of his being. The Albanian forests that had once witnessed his triumph in claiming Ravenclaw's diadem now became his prison, their ancient trees standing as silent witnesses to his degradation from conqueror to parasite. The magical creatures that dwelt in these remote woodlands provided the only vessels capable of housing his consciousness for any meaningful duration. but even the strongest among them could endure his presence for only brief periods before their life force was drained beyond recovery. It was in this wilderness of exile and humiliation that Voldemort first encountered the man who would become instrumental in his resurrection, though neither recognized the other's significance during their initial meeting. Professor Quirinus Quirrell had come to Albania seeking knowledge that might enhance his defense against the dark arts curriculum, his academic curiosity leading him into forests that most sensible wizards avoided entirely. What he found instead was something that would transform him from a nervous teacher into an unwilling vessel for the darkest consciousness in the magical world. The possession of Quirrell represented Voldemort's first real opportunity in over a decade to influence events beyond the limited scope of his forest exile, though the process required adaptation to hosting his consciousness within a human mind, rather than the simpler awareness of the animals he had been reduced to inhabiting. Quirrell's body was weak and his magical abilities mediocre, but his human intellect provided capabilities that no mere creature could offer, allowing Voldemort to begin planning for a more substantial return to power. But the union between the weakened Dark Lord and his reluctant host was imperfect and ultimately unsustainable, creating a hybrid consciousness that suffered constant internal conflict as Quirrell's original personality struggled against the foreign presence that had invaded his mind and soul. The physical strain of maintaining such an arrangement was enormous, aging the defense professor visibly and creating the nervous mannerisms that would characterize his behavior during his final year at Hogwarts. The decision to return to Britain and seek employment at Hogwarts was driven by Voldemort's recognition that the school housed both the Philosopher's Stone and Harry Potter, two elements that could prove crucial to his restoration to full power. The stone offered the possibility of creating an elixir that might provide him with independent physical form, while proximity to Harry would allow him to study the boy who had somehow survived his killing curse and potentially discover the source of whatever protection had caused his downfall. The months that Quirrell spent teaching at Hogwarts while serving as an unwilling host to Voldemort's consciousness were a study in the gradual deterioration of both participants in this forced partnership. The professor's health declined steadily under the strain of housing a soul fragment that had been corrupted beyond recognition through repeated acts of murder and magical violation. Meanwhile, Voldemort found himself frustrated by the limitations of operating through such a weak and unstable vessel, his grand plans constantly hampered by Quirrell's physical and magical inadequacies. The quest for the Philosopher's Stone became the focal point of Voldemort's efforts during this period, representing what appeared to be his best opportunity to regain independent existence without requiring the complex rituals that would be needed to restore his original body. The stone's power to grant immortality seemed perfectly suited to his needs, offering a potential shortcut to the kind of eternal existence he had sought to achieve through the creation of Horcruxes. But the protections surrounding the stone proved to be more formidable than either Voldemort or Quirrell had anticipated, designed by some of the most skilled wizards of their generation to prevent exactly the kind of theft they were attempting. Each obstacle required different skills and knowledge to overcome, creating a gauntlet that tested not just magical ability but wisdom, courage, and moral character in ways that neither of the would-be thieves possessed. The confrontation with Harry Potter in the chamber where the stone was hidden revealed both the extent of Voldemort's desperation and the continuing power of the protection that Lily Potter's sacrifice had created around her. Son, the moment Quirrell attempted to physically harm Harry, the same ancient magic that had once turned away the killing curse manifested as a burning agony that made contact impossible to maintain. The destruction that followed was swift and inevitable, the unstable union between Voldemort and Quirrell collapsing under the strain of encountering magic that their corrupted souls could not withstand. Quirrell's death was both release and abandonment, freeing him from the torment of hosting an unwelcome consciousness, while simultaneously depriving Voldemort of the vessel that had allowed him to function in the physical world. According to revelations that would later emerge from the most authoritative sources, the crisis of Quirrell's destruction had forced Voldemort into another desperate gambit for survival that demonstrated both his resourcefulness and his complete lack of regard for any life other than his own. The fragmented consciousness that fled Quirrell's dying body had latched onto the only other suitable vessel it could find, a creature whose magical nature and emotional simplicity made it capable of housing a soul fragment without immediate destruction. The temporary Horcrux created within Quirrell had been both salvation and limitation, providing Voldemort with a form of anchored existence while trapping him within the constraints of a human host whose body was gradually being consumed by forces it was never meant to contain. The arrangement was inherently unstable and ultimately doomed, but it had served its purpose by keeping his consciousness intact during a period when complete dissolution had seemed inevitable. The years that followed Quirrell's death marked perhaps the lowest point in Voldemort's long existence, reducing him once again to the parasitic wandering that had characterized his Albanian exile, but now complicated by the growing awareness among magical authorities that he might still pose a threat. The incident at Hogwarts had revealed his survival to those with the knowledge and skill to recognize the signs, making future possessions more dangerous as potential hosts learned to guard against the kind of mental invasion that had destroyed Quirrell. But it was during this period of renewed desperation that fate provided Voldemort with the most devoted and capable servant he had ever possessed, a wizard whose loyalty had been proven through years of imprisonment in Azkaban, and whose skills were precisely suited to the kind of complex magical work that would be required for the Dark Lord's resurrection. Peter Pettigrew, the man whose betrayal had made possible the attack on the Potter family, had spent 12 years living as a rat to avoid the consequences of his treachery. Pettigrew's discovery of his master's continued existence came about through circumstances that seemed almost providential in their convenience. The confluence of events that brought him into contact with Voldemort's weakened consciousness, just as both were approaching the limits of their respective endurances. For Pettigrew, years of living in animal form had taken a psychological toll that made human contact desperately necessary, while for Voldemort, the need for a capable servant had become critical to his hopes of achieving anything more substantial than mere survival. The reunion between master and servant was conducted with all the ceremony that their reduced circumstances could manage, but beneath the formal acknowledgements lay mutual dependencies that neither could afford to ignore. Pettigrew needed Voldemort's protection from the justice that awaited him in the wizarding world, while Voldemort required Pettigrew's human form and magical abilities to accomplish the resurrection ritual that would restore his body and power. The months of preparation that followed were devoted to gathering the ingredients and arranging the circumstances needed for the complex magical working that would create a new physical form for the Dark Lord's consciousness. The ritual they planned was ancient and terrible, requiring components that could be obtained only through acts of violence and betrayal that would test even Pettigrew's corrupted moral standards. The capture and murder of Bertha Jorkins represented the culmination of this preparatory phase, providing both the life force needed to sustain Voldemort during the resurrection process and the soul-splitting trauma required for the creation of his final Horcrux. Jorkins had been selected not for any personal significance, but for her knowledge of ministry operations and her vulnerability as a solitary traveler whose disappearance might not be immediately noticed by authorities. The creation of Nagini as a Horcrux marked a significant departure from Voldemort's previous approach to protecting fragments of his soul, representing both practical adaptation to his changed circumstances and symbolic acknowledgement of his complete transformation from human wizard to something fundamentally different. Unlike his previous Horcruxes, which had been hidden away in secure locations, Nagini would remain constantly at his side as both guardian and companion, her serpentine nature reflecting the reptilian consciousness that he had become. The choice of a living creature as a Horcrux vessel carried both advantages and risks that Voldemort had carefully calculated before proceeding with the soul-splitting ritual. A snake could defend itself in ways that inanimate objects could not, could move independently to avoid threats, and could serve as his eyes and ears in situations where his own presence might be dangerous. But a living Horcrux was also more vulnerable than a hidden artifact, susceptible to diseases and aging and the kind of targeted attacks that enemies might direct against known associates. The ritual that restored Voldemort's physical form was conducted in the graveyard where his father's bones lay buried, a location chosen for both its symbolic significance and its practical advantages, as a site where dark magic could be worked without attracting unwanted attention. The components required for the resurrection were gathered through acts that violated every principle of civilized magical practice. Bone of the father, unknowingly given, flesh of the servant willingly sacrificed, and blood of the enemy forcibly taken. The new body that emerged from this terrible working was both restoration and improvement, incorporating magical enhancements that made it more resilient and powerful than his original form, while retaining the essential characteristics that marked it as belonging to Tom Riddle. But the process had also left him fundamentally changed in ways that went beyond mere physical alteration. His consciousness now distributed across multiple vessels in patterns that made his existence more secure but also more complex than any wizard had ever achieved. The discovery that his diary Horcrux had been destroyed during his years of exile filled Voldemort with a rage that transcended normal human emotion. The recognition that one of his anchors to immortality had been eliminated without his knowledge representing a violation of his carefully constructed security that demanded immediate investigation and eventual revenge. The circumstances of the diary's destruction revealed troubling patterns of resistance that suggested his enemies possessed both knowledge and capabilities that he had not anticipated. But perhaps more disturbing than the loss of a single Horcrux was the revelation that someone had penetrated his secrets deeply enough to recognize the diary's true nature and take effective action against it. The use of basilisk venom to destroy the artifact indicated either remarkable intuition or substantial knowledge about the specific vulnerabilities of objects containing soul fragments, suggesting that his methods might not be as secret as he had believed. The creation of his seventh Horcrux in Nagini represented the completion of his grand design for immortality, the achievement of the perfect magical number that would make his soul more resilient to destruction than any wizard in history had ever managed. But the accomplishment also marked the end of his humanity in ways that were both subtle and profound, the final severance of connections to the mortal existence that had once defined his nature and limitations. The consciousness that had been Tom Riddle was now distributed across 8 fragments, 7 Horcruxes, and the portion that remained within his restored body, creating a network of existence that was theoretically immune to any form of destruction that his enemies might attempt. Each piece was hidden or protected, according to careful strategic planning that drew upon decades of experience in magical concealment and defense. The diary had been lost, but 6 anchors remained, more than sufficient to ensure his continued existence, even in the face of the most determined opposition. But the distribution of his soul across multiple vessels had also created vulnerabilities that he was only beginning to understand, connections and resonances that could potentially be exploited by enemies with sufficient knowledge and determination. The bond with Harry Potter that had been created through the accidental Horcrux formation was particularly troubling. providing his greatest enemy with insights into his thoughts and activities that could prove tactically disadvantageous in future confrontations. The Dark Lord who emerged from the graveyard ritual was both more and less than the wizard who had been destroyed at Godric's Hollow 13 years earlier. His magical power had been restored and enhanced, his physical form made more resilient through the incorporation of elements that transcended normal human limitations. But his connection to humanity had been severed so completely through the creation of 7 Horcruxes that what remained was essentially a collection of soul fragments, masquerading as a complete being. The war that would follow his resurrection would be fought by someone who was no longer entirely alive in any meaningful sense, a creature whose existence depended upon magical artifacts rather than natural life force, and whose consciousness had been so fractured through repeated acts of murder that normal human motivations and emotions had become entirely foreign to his nature. Lord Voldemort had achieved the immortality he had sought, but the price had been the complete destruction of Tom Riddle and everything that had once made him recognizably human. The network of Horcruxes that sustained his existence was both his greatest achievement and his ultimate weakness, providing security through redundancy, while creating points of vulnerability that enemies might exploit if they possessed sufficient knowledge and determination. The game of immortality had reached its crucial phase, with all the major pieces now in position for the final confrontation that would determine whether love or hatred, creation or destruction, life or the perverse mockery of life that Voldemort had become, would ultimately prevail in the magical world's greatest conflict. The revelation that Lord Voldemort had returned to physical form sent tremors of terror through the wizarding world that had grown comfortable in the belief that their greatest enemy had been permanently vanquished by an infant's inexplicable survival. But while the broader magical community struggled to accept this impossible truth, there was one wizard whose brilliant mind had never ceased to search for evidence of the Dark Lord's continued existence, whose understanding of magic's deepest principles had led him to conclusions that others found too terrifying to contemplate. Albus Dumbledore had spent the years since Voldemort's apparent destruction pursuing knowledge that most wizards would have considered purely academic, delving into the darkest corners of magical theory, not from morbid curiosity, but from the growing conviction that Tom Riddle's quest for immortality had succeeded in ways that the wizarding world did not understand. The signs had been subtle but unmistakable to someone with the wisdom to recognize them. Magical disturbances that suggested a powerful consciousness operating without physical form, unexplained deaths that bore the hallmarks of encounters with forces that should not have existed, and most significantly, Harry Potter's scar, and the dreams that spoke of connections that transcended normal magical understanding. The investigation that had consumed Dumbledore's private hours for over a decade was conducted with the methodical precision of a scholar whose brilliant mind was matched by profound understanding of the historical precedents that might explain seemingly impossible phenomena. Ancient texts yielded fragments of information about magical practices so dark that their very existence was disputed by most authorities, while genealogical research revealed family connections that might provide clues about Voldemort's origins and the methods he might have employed in his quest for eternal life. The breakthrough that would ultimately lead to understanding came through Dumbledore's recognition of patterns in Voldemort's behavior during his Hogwarts years, subtle indicators that the brilliant student had been pursuing knowledge that went far beyond normal academic curiosity. The young Tom Riddle's interest in the boundaries between life and death, his questions about theoretical applications of the darkest magic, his ability to charm information from reluctant sources, all suggested systematic research into subjects that most wizards would never dare to contemplate. The concept of Horcruxes had been so thoroughly suppressed from magical education that even Dumbledore's vast knowledge contained only fragmentary references to the practice, whispered accounts of ancient wizards who had allegedly achieved a form of immortality through the deliberate splitting of their souls. The very notion was so repugnant to civilized magical thinking that serious scholarly investigation had been discouraged for centuries, leaving the subject shrouded in myth and speculation rather than documented fact. But Dumbledore's research into Voldemort's family history provided the key that unlocked the mystery of Tom Riddle's transformation from brilliant student to seemingly immortal Dark Lord. The name Marvolo, which Tom bore as his middle name, led through genealogical records to the Gaunt family and their connection to Salazar Slytherin's bloodline. More importantly, it revealed the existence of heirloom objects that might serve as repositories for fragments of a split soul, artifacts whose historical significance would make them attractive to someone seeking vessels for the darkest magic imaginable. The journey to the ruins of the Gaunt house was undertaken with the reverence due to a pilgrimage to a site of profound magical significance, though the significance in this case was entirely malevolent rather than sacred. The hovel that had once housed the remnants of one of Wizarding Britain's oldest pure-blood families was a monument to decline and decay, its crumbling walls bearing witness to the price of genetic isolation and ideological extremism. The protective enchantments that surrounded the hidden ring were masterworks of defensive magic that would have challenged even the most skilled curse breakers. But Dumbledore's century of magical study had prepared him for exactly this kind of sophisticated magical warfare. Each layer of protection had to be analyzed and understood before it could be safely dismantled. A process that required not just technical skill, but profound insight into the mind that had created such elaborate defenses. The ring itself, when finally revealed, was both exactly what Dumbledore had expected and far more significant than he had dared to hope. The Gaunt family heirloom was indeed a Horcrux, its black stone pulsing with malevolent energy that spoke of the soul fragment bound within its depths. But the stone was also something else entirely, something that connected this particular artifact to legends that predated even the founding of Hogwarts itself. The Resurrection Stone, one of the 3 Deathly Hallows, had been incorporated into the Gaunt ring without Voldemort's knowledge of its true nature, creating a convergence of dark magic and ancient power that made the artifact doubly dangerous to handle. Dumbledore's recognition of the stone's significance created a moment of temptation so powerful that it overrode decades of careful caution and prudent magical practice. The desire to speak once more with those he had loved and lost proved stronger than his intellectual understanding of the stone's dangers, leading him to place the ring upon his finger, despite knowing that it carried curses designed to kill anyone foolish enough to wear it. The vision that followed was both everything he had hoped for and nothing that could provide genuine comfort, showing him shades of the dead that were more memory than reality, phantoms that spoke words he wanted to hear, rather than truths he needed to understand. The curse that resulted from his moment of weakness was both punishment for his folly and testament to Voldemort's skill in crafting magical protections that exploited human nature's deepest vulnerabilities. The withering that began in his right hand was only the visible manifestation of magical corruption that was slowly spreading through his body, a death sentence that could be slowed but not reversed through even the most advanced healing magic available. But Severus Snape's intervention proved crucial in containing the curse's spread, his mastery of the darkest arts providing knowledge that conventional healing could never have supplied. The containment ritual that limited the corruption to Dumbledore's hand was itself a work of dangerous magic that demonstrated Snape's willingness to risk his own safety, to preserve the life of someone whose trust he had earned through years of service and sacrifice. The destruction of the ring, Horcrux required methods that went beyond conventional spellcasting, demanding tools that had been imbued with power sufficient to overcome the magical protections that bound the soul fragment to its vessel. The Sword of Gryffindor, enhanced by its absorption of basilisk venom during Harry Potter's encounter with the Chamber of Secrets monster, provided exactly the kind of destructive capability needed to sever the connection between Voldemort's soul and the ring that housed it. The moment of the Horcruxes' destruction was both triumph and tragedy. The successful elimination of one anchor to Voldemort's immortality purchased at the cost of Dumbledore's own life expectancy. The curse that would eventually claim him was the price of learning secrets that few wizards had ever discovered. Knowledge that would prove essential to understanding how the Dark Lord might finally be defeated permanently. But perhaps the most significant aspect of the ring's destruction was the confirmation it provided of Dumbledore's theories about Voldemort's methods and motivations. The existence of even one Horcrux suggested that others might exist, hidden throughout the wizarding world in locations that would require systematic investigation to uncover. The task of finding and destroying these additional soul fragments would become the central focus of the war effort, a quest that would demand everything the forces of light could muster. The intelligence gathered from Voldemort's memories, accessed through methods that pushed the boundaries of acceptable magical investigation, revealed the scope of his Horcrux creation in ways that were both illuminating and deeply disturbing. The systematic murder of specific individuals chosen for their symbolic significance, the careful selection of objects that carried personal or historical importance, the elaborate hiding places protected by curses designed to challenge even the most skilled investigators, all spoke of a mind that had planned for immortality with the same methodical precision that characterized his approach to every other aspect of magical study. The revelation that Harry Potter himself carried a fragment of Voldemort's soul was perhaps the most devastating discovery of all, explaining the connection between them while revealing the ultimate sacrifice that would be required for the Dark Lord's complete destruction. The boy who had survived the killing curse was also the unwitting guardian of his enemy's immortality, carrying within him the very force that would need to be eliminated before Voldemort could be permanently defeated. The education that Dumbledore provided to Harry about the nature of Horcruxes was conducted with the gentle care of a grandfather sharing difficult truths with a beloved grandchild, tempering the harsh realities of what would be required with reassurances about the strength and courage that would make such sacrifices meaningful. The lessons about love's power to overcome even the darkest magic were not mere philosophy but practical instruction in the forces that would ultimately determine the war's outcome. The memories that Dumbledore had collected about Voldemort's past were more than historical curiosities but tactical intelligence that revealed patterns in the Dark Lord's thinking and behavior that could be exploited by those with sufficient understanding and determination. Each fragment of information about Tom Riddle's transformation added another piece to the puzzle of how he might be defeated, providing insights that would prove crucial when the final confrontations began. The pensieve that housed these precious memories became a repository of knowledge more valuable than any magical artifact, containing information that had been gathered through decades of patient investigation and careful analysis. The scenes it preserved were windows into moments of profound significance, revealing the gradual transformation of a brilliant student into the most dangerous dark wizard in history, through choices that had seemed reasonable at the time, but had led inexorably to monstrosity. The network of agents and allies that Dumbledore had cultivated over the years provided the intelligence-gathering capability needed to track down the remaining Horcruxes, though the task would require resources and sacrifices that would test everyone involved to their absolute limits. The Order of the Phoenix, reformed to meet the renewed threat, brought together witches and wizards whose diverse skills would be essential for the complex operations ahead. But perhaps the most crucial element in the coming struggle was the growing understanding that this war could not be won through conventional magical combat, but would require a willingness to make sacrifices that challenged every assumption about the value of individual life compared to the greater good. The destruction of Horcruxes would demand not just magical skill, but moral courage of the highest order, the willingness to do what was necessary, even when the personal cost seemed unbearable. The hunt for the remaining soul fragments began in earnest as Dumbledore's remaining time grew short, each day bringing him closer to the death that the ring's curse would eventually claim, while also bringing the forces of light closer to understanding how Voldemort's immortality might be permanently ended. The race against time was complicated by the need for secrecy, as revealing too much about their knowledge might prompt the Dark Lord to relocate or better protect the artifacts that anchored his existence. The investigation into the cave where Slytherin's locket was hidden represented the culmination of months of research and preparation, drawing upon every clue that had been gathered about Voldemort's methods and psychology. The decision to retrieve the Horcrux personally rather than sending agents reflected both the mission's extreme danger and Dumbledore's recognition that his remaining time was too limited to waste on elaborate planning that might not account for all contingencies. The journey to the seaside cave was undertaken with the solemnity appropriate to what both participants understood might be their final collaboration, Harry's presence serving multiple purposes beyond mere assistance with the magical challenges they would face. The experience would provide crucial education about the methods Voldemort used to protect his Horcruxes, while also demonstrating the kind of courage and sacrifice that would be required in the battles ahead. The protections surrounding the locket proved to be even more diabolical than Dumbledore's research had suggested, designed not just to prevent theft but to inflict maximum suffering on anyone who attempted to claim the artifact. The potion that guarded the Horcrux was a masterwork of malicious creativity, forcing whoever drank it to experience their worst memories and deepest fears while slowly poisoning their body and mind. Dumbledore's insistence on consuming the potion himself, rather than allowing Harry to share the burden, was both practical necessity and moral instruction, demonstrating the kind of selfless leadership that would be required from all who stood against the forces of darkness. His willingness to endure agony for the sake of advancing their mission provided an example of courage that would sustain Harry through the trials ahead. The discovery that the locket they had claimed was a fake represented both devastating disappointment and crucial intelligence about the effectiveness of Voldemort's security measures. Someone else had penetrated the cave's defenses and claimed the real Horcrux, leaving behind a message that suggested the theft had been motivated by opposition to the Dark Lord rather than personal gain. The investigation into the identity of R.A.B., the mysterious figure who had signed the note left in place of the real locket, would consume precious time that Dumbledore could ill afford to spend. But the information gathered would ultimately prove essential to understanding how the Horcrux hunt might continue after his death. The revelation that Regulus Arcturus Black had discovered Voldemort's secret and died attempting to destroy a Horcrux provided both inspiration and practical guidance for the efforts that would follow. The final phase of Dumbledore's life was devoted to ensuring that Harry would possess both the knowledge and the emotional strength needed to complete the task of Horcrux destruction, even if it required sacrifices that no one should be asked to make. The lessons about love's power were not abstract philosophy, but practical preparation for confronting forces that could be overcome only through complete selflessness and unwavering commitment to protecting others. The silver hand that replaced Dumbledore's withered limb served as a constant reminder of the prices that would be required from all who stood against Voldemort, while his gradually failing health provided urgent motivation for completing preparations that could not be postponed until more convenient circumstances might arise. The greatest wizard of his generation was dying, and with his death would go knowledge and wisdom that could never be fully replaced. But the legacy he was creating through Harry's education would survive his death and continue to guide the forces of light through the darkest hours that lay ahead. The understanding of Horcruxes, the knowledge of Voldemort's psychology, the network of allies and resources, all would remain as tools for the final phase of a war that had already claimed too many good lives and would claim many more before its conclusion. The hunt for the remaining Horcruxes had begun with the destruction of the ring, but that first success had come at a cost that demonstrated the magnitude of the challenge ahead. Each soul fragment would demand its own price from those who sought to destroy it, requiring sacrifices that would test the resolve of everyone involved while bringing them closer to the ultimate confrontation that would determine the fate of the wizarding world. The months that followed Dumbledore's death were perhaps the darkest in the history of the wizarding world since Voldemort's first rise to power, as the forces of evil consolidated their control over magical Britain, while the scattered remnants of resistance struggled to comprehend the magnitude of the task that had been left to them. The greatest wizard of the age was gone, taking with him not just his formidable magical abilities, but the wisdom and knowledge that had guided the fight against darkness for so many years. In his place stood 3 teenagers, whose only qualifications for the monumental responsibility they had inherited were courage that bordered on recklessness and a determination that refused to acknowledge the impossibility of their mission. Harry Potter, Hermione Granger, and Ron Weasley had accepted the burden of hunting down and destroying the remaining Horcruxes with the kind of absolute commitment that only youth could muster, their lack of experience balanced by an understanding of the stakes that made failure literally unthinkable. They carried with them not just the magical tools and knowledge that Dumbledore had provided, but the weight of expectations from a wizarding world that needed to believe that hope still existed, even in the darkest of times. The quest for Slytherin's locket began with investigations into the identity of R.A.B., the mysterious figure whose note in the fake Horcrux had provided the only clue about what had happened to the real artifact. The revelation that Regulus Arcturus Black had penetrated Voldemort's most elaborate defenses and stolen the locket during his brief rebellion against his Death Eater allegiance provided both inspiration and practical guidance for their own efforts to locate the missing soul fragment. The return to Grimmauld Place, now serving as headquarters for the decimated Order of the Phoenix, was undertaken with the grim recognition that they were retracing the steps of someone who had died, attempting the same mission they were now pursuing. The house itself seemed to reflect the tragedy of its former occupants' fate, its walls echoing with the ghosts of better times when the Black family had possessed both power and purpose beyond mere survival. Kreacher, the ancient house elf whose devotion to his deceased master had been tested beyond endurance during Regulus's doomed mission, held the key to understanding what had happened to the locket after its theft from Voldemort's cave. But extracting that information required overcoming decades of bitterness and resentment that had transformed the creature from a faithful servant into something approaching a force of malevolent chaos within the house he was bound to protect. The story that emerged from Kreacher's reluctant testimony was a masterpiece of heroism and tragedy that revealed depths of courage in Regulus Black that few had suspected during his brief life. The young Death Eater's horror at witnessing Voldemort's treatment of his house elf had awakened moral sensibilities that his pure-blood upbringing had taught him to suppress, leading him to risk everything in an attempt to strike a blow against the Dark Lord's immortality. The sacrifice that Regulus had made during his infiltration of the cave demonstrated the kind of selfless leadership that would be required from all who stood against Voldemort. His willingness to drink the torture potion while ordering Kreacher to escape with the real locket, proving that even those raised in darkness could choose light when confronted with ultimate moral tests. His death by Inferi had been both horrible and heroic, the ending of a young life that had finally found purpose worthy of the Black family legacy. but Creature's attempts to destroy the locket had proven futile despite his desperate efforts and magical creativity. The Horcruxes' protections, proving resistant to everything the house elf could devise. Years of failure had driven him to increasingly desperate measures that had accomplished nothing except to deepen his anguish at being unable to fulfill his beloved master's final command. The discovery that Mundungus Fletcher had stolen the locket, along with numerous other valuable items during his unauthorized clearing of Grimmauld Place, added another layer of complexity to their search, transforming what should have been a simple recovery operation into a hunt through London's criminal underworld for a thief whose priorities were entirely mercenary rather than ideological. The investigation into Fletcher's disposal of his stolen goods led them through a network of black market dealers and questionable establishments where magical artifacts changed hands without regard for their historical significance or potentiel danger. The locket had been sold as merely another piece of antique jewelry, its true nature unknown to buyers who were interested only in its monetary value rather than its significance as a repository for evil. The trail that eventually led to Dolores Umbridge represented a convergence of their various missions that would have been amusing under less desperate circumstances. The discovery that their target possessed not just the locket they sought, but also served as a symbol of everything corrupt about the wizarding establishment they were fighting to preserve. Umbridge's rise to power within the Ministry reflected the broader transformation of magical government from protector to oppressor, her personal cruelties now backed by official authority that made her more dangerous than ever. The infiltration of the Ministry of Magic required planning and preparation that drew upon every skill they had developed during their years of breaking rules and evading authority. But the stakes were now immeasurably higher than any school-based mischief they had previously attempted. Discovery would mean not just detention or expulsion, but death or worse, torture at the hands of interrogators who had perfected their techniques through practice on genuine dissidents and resistance fighters. The polyjuice potion that allowed them to assume the identities of Ministry employees provided access to the corridors of power where Umbridge conducted her campaign of persecution against Muggle-born witches and wizards. But the transformation was more than physical, requiring them to embody the attitudes and behaviors of people whose moral compromises had made them complicit in institutionalized evil. The courtroom where Umbridge conducted her trials was a perversion of justice that would have been horrifying even without the presence of the Dementors she had summoned to intimidate her victims into compliance. The sight of innocent witches and wizards being forced to prove their worthiness to exist in the magical world created a rage in Harry that transcended personal anger to become something approaching righteous fury. The recovery of the locket required confronting Umbridge directly, a task that demanded not just magical skill, but the moral courage to stand against authority that had become tyrannical through the systematic abandonment of principles that should have guided its exercise. The battle that followed was less about spell casting than about the clash between different visions of what magical society should represent and protect. The escape from the Ministry with both the locket and several rescued Muggle-born prisoners was accomplished through a combination of luck, skill, and desperate improvisation that left all participants understanding how close they had come to complete disaster. But they had achieved their primary objective while also striking a blow against the apparatus of oppression that was systematically destroying everything decent about their world. The locket that they had recovered proved to be even more malevolent than they had expected, its influence extending beyond mere passive evil to active psychological manipulation that sought to corrupt and destroy anyone who came into contact with it for extended periods. The Horcrux seemed to feed on negative emotions, amplifying fear and anger and resentment until they threatened to tear apart the bonds of friendship that held their small group together. The decision to take turns wearing the locket while they searched for methods of its destruction was both practical necessity and shared sacrifice, distributing the burden of exposure to its corrupting influence while ensuring that no single person would bear the full weight of its malevolent presence. But even this precaution proved insufficient to prevent the psychological damage that accumulated with each day of contact with Voldemort's fractured soul. Ron's departure from their group during a period when the locket's influence had reached its peak represented the most serious crisis they had yet faced. The loss of not just a powerful wizard, but a loyal friend whose absence created vulnerabilities that their enemies might exploit. The words spoken in anger during his departure carried wounds that would require healing even if he chose to return to their mission. The search for methods to destroy the locket led them through research that revealed the limited number of substances and forces capable of permanently damaging objects that contained fragments of human souls. Basilisk venom, the most accessible option, had been used successfully against the diary Horcrux, while fiendfire represented a more dangerous but potentially effective alternative that few wizards possessed the skill to control safely. The Sword of Gryffindor, enhanced by its absorption of basilisk venom during Harry's encounter with the chamber monster, provided the perfect tool for Horcrux destruction, if they could locate it among the artifacts that the Ministry had confiscated from Dumbledore's office. But recovering the sword would require infiltration operations that might be even more dangerous than their Ministry mission, as Hogwarts itself had become a fortress controlled by Death Eaters and their sympathizers. The appearance of Severus Snape's doe, Patronus, leading them to the frozen pool where the sword lay hidden represented intervention from sources they had not expected, though the identity of their mysterious benefactor remained unclear. The silver doe that guided them through the darkness carried echoes of magic they had encountered before, suggesting connections that would not become clear until much later in their quest. The retrieval of the sword from beneath the icy water required courage that went beyond mere physical bravery, as the locket's influence intensified dramatically when brought near an object that could destroy it permanently. The Horcruxes' desperate attempts to prevent its own destruction manifested as psychological attacks that struck at the deepest fears and insecurities of whoever wore it, creating visions designed to break their will and prevent the completion of their mission. Ron's unexpected return at the crucial moment provided not just the physical assistance needed to complete the sword's recovery, but emotional healing that repaired bonds damaged by the locket's malevolent influence. His willingness to face the visions that the Horcrux conjured, images of his worst fears made manifest through dark magic, demonstrated growth and maturity that had been forged through hardship and separation. The destruction of Slytherin's locket was accomplished through combined effort that required both wielders to overcome the psychological attacks that reached their peak intensity at the moment when the sword finally pierced the Horcrux defense. The screams that emerged from the dying artifact were more than mere sound, but expressions of rage and hatred so pure that they seemed to tear at the very fabric of reality around them. The successful elimination of the second Horcrux provided both tactical victory and psychological relief, proof that their mission was possible, despite the enormous challenges they faced. But it also served as stark reminder of the prices that would be required for each subsequent success, the personal costs that accumulated with each encounter with fragments of Voldemort's corrupted soul. The intelligence they gathered from various sources suggested that additional Horcruxes existed in locations that would require even more dangerous operations to access, with Hufflepuff's cup reportedly hidden in the Lestrange family vault at Gringotts Wizarding Bank. The prospect of infiltrating what was arguably the most secure location in magical Britain created planning challenges that tested their creativity and resourcefulness to their absolute limits. The decision to attempt the Gringotts break-in was driven by recognition that time was working against them as Voldemort's control over wizarding society became more complete with each passing day. The longer they waited, the more difficult their mission would become, as security measures were enhanced and their own ability to operate covertly was compromised by increasing surveillance and pursuit. The infiltration of Gringotts required deception on multiple levels, beginning with the use of Polyjuice Potion to assume the identity of Bellatrix Lestrange and extending to the manipulation of Goblin Greed and Pride to gain access to the deepest vaults where the most precious treasures were stored. But even perfect disguises could not overcome the magical protections that the bank had developed over centuries of safeguarding wizarding wealth against every conceivable form of theft. The dragon that guarded the deepest vaults represented both obstacle and opportunity, its conditioning through years of painful training, having created reflexes that could be exploited by those with sufficient understanding of its psychology. But escaping the bank's security would require methods that none of them had ever attempted. Desperate improvisations that pushed the boundaries of what magic could accomplish under extreme duress. The successful theft of Hufflepuff's cup was accomplished at enormous cost in terms of exposure and future operational security, their dramatic escape on Dragonback, ensuring that Voldemort would immediately understand what they were attempting to accomplish. But they had achieved another crucial victory in their quest to eliminate the anchors that maintained his immortality, proving that even the most elaborate defenses could be overcome through determination and careful planning. The cup's destruction followed the same pattern as the locket, requiring them to overcome psychological attacks while administering basilisk venom through the medium of the Sword of Gryffindor. But each Horcrux seemed to fight its destruction with increasing desperation, as if the remaining fragments were becoming more aware of the systematic elimination of their companions and the growing threat to Voldemort's continued existence. The intelligence that reached them about conditions at Hogwarts suggested that their former school had become a battleground where students and faculty struggled to maintain some semblance of educational purpose while under the control of Death Eaters whose vision of magical education emphasized obedience and ideological conformity over learning and intellectual growth. The decision to return to Hogwarts was driven partly by intelligence, suggesting that another Horcrux was hidden within the castle's walls, and partly by recognition that the final phase of their war would require the symbolic power that came from fighting for the place where they had first learned what it meant to be part of the magical community. The revelation from Helena Ravenclaw's ghost about the location of her mother's diadem provided the final piece of intelligence needed to complete their understanding of Voldemort's Horcrux locations, confirming that the Room of Requirement concealed not just the artifact they sought, but represented the Dark Lord's arrogance in believing he could hide something within Hogwarts more successfully than the founders themselves had protected their treasures. The search through the Room of Requirement's accumulated debris was conducted under time pressure that intensified with each passing moment, as the sounds of battle from other parts of the castle indicated that their presence had been discovered and that Death Eater forces were mobilizing to prevent their mission's completion. The diadem's location among thousands of discarded objects required intuition as much as systematic searching, guided by understanding of how Voldemort's mind worked when selecting hiding places for his most precious possessions. The confrontation with Draco Malfoy, Crabbe, and Goyle in the Room of Requirement represented more than mere personal conflict, but a clash between different visions of what the magical world should become under Voldemort's rule. The battle that followed was fought not just with spells, but with competing ideologies about power and its proper use in service of larger purposes. The fiend fire that Crabbe unleashed in his desperate attempt to kill Harry and his friends proved to be both weapon and destroyer the cursed flames consuming not just the room's contents but the Horcrux they sought to protect, while creating dangers that threatened everyone present, regardless of their allegiances. The magical fire that destroyed Ravenclaw's diadem accomplished their mission, while demonstrating the chaotic nature of forces that even their enemies could not fully control. The escape from the burning room of requirement required heroism from unexpected sources, as ancient loyalties proved stronger than recent enmities when survival itself was at stake. But the successful destruction of another Horcrux brought them closer to their ultimate goal, while also reducing the time available for completing their mission, as Voldemort's growing awareness of their activities would inevitably lead to more direct confrontation. The realization that only 2 Horcruxes remained, Harry himself and Nagini, created both hope and despair in equal measure. The prospect of victory balanced against the personal cost that would be required to achieve it. The knowledge that Harry carried a fragment of Voldemort's soul meant that his own death would be necessary before the Dark Lord could be permanently defeated, a sacrifice that challenged every assumption about heroism and its ultimate requirements. But even this terrible knowledge could not diminish the significance of what they had accomplished through months of patient hunting and dangerous missions. Their systematic elimination of Voldemort's anchors to immortality, representing the most successful campaign against a dark wizard in the history of the magical world. 5 Horcruxes had been destroyed, leaving only 2 fragments of a soul that had been split beyond any hope of repair or redemption. The final phase of their quest would require not just magical skill and physical courage, but spiritual strength of a kind that few had ever been asked to demonstrate. The willingness to sacrifice everything for the sake of future generations who would inherit whatever world emerged from the coming confrontation. The hunt for Horcruxes was nearly complete, but the greatest challenges still lay ahead in the darkness that was about to engulf them all. The truth that Harry Potter carried within himself a fragment of Lord Voldemort's fractured soul had been the most closely guarded secret of the war against darkness, a knowledge so devastating in its implications that even Dumbledore had struggled with when and how to reveal it to the young man whose death it would ultimately require. The revelation came not through gentle preparation or careful explanation, but through the brutal clarity of Severus Snape's final memories, witnessed in the moments after his death at the fangs of Nagini in the Shrieking Shack, where so many secrets had been born and buried over the years. The silver strands of memory that flowed from Snape's dying eyes contained truths that recontextualized everything Harry had believed about his relationship with the Dark Lord, explaining the connection that had allowed him to glimpse Voldemort's thoughts and emotions, while revealing the ultimate sacrifice that would be required for evil's defeat. The boy who lived had survived that night in Godric's Hollow not just through his mother's protection, but by becoming an unwitting vessel for the very enemy he was destined to destroy. The walk through the Forbidden Forest toward his appointed death was perhaps the longest journey of Harry's life, each step carrying him further from the world of the living and closer to a destiny that demanded everything he had to give. The resurrection stone that he held in trembling fingers provided the only comfort available in those final moments, summoning shades of those who had loved him most to walk beside him into darkness that even their presence could not fully illuminate. His parents, Sirius and Remus, appeared around him like guardian angels made of moonlight and memory, their forms more solid than mere ghosts but less substantial than living beings, existing in that liminal space between death and life, where love transcended the boundaries that normally separated the worlds. Their words of encouragement and pride could not change what was about to happen, but provided the emotional strength needed to face annihilation with courage rather than despair. The clearing where Voldemort waited with his inner circle of Death Eaters had been chosen for its symbolic significance as much as its practical advantages, a place where the forest's ancient magic would witness the final confrontation between the forces of creation and destruction, love and hatred, life and the perverse mockery of existence that the Dark Lord had become through his systematic destruction of his own humanity. Voldemort himself stood at the center of his followers like a dark star, around which lesser evils orbited, his red eyes gleaming with anticipation of a victory that would finally eliminate the threat that Harry's existence represented to his vision of eternal dominance. The Horcrux within Harry called to its source like a magnet seeking iron, the fragment of soul recognizing its origin and yearning for the reunion that would come through the boy's death. The moment of the killing curse was both ending and beginning. The green light that erupted from Voldemort's wand, carrying with it the full force of his hatred and the accumulated malice of a being who had transcended human limitations through the systematic violation of every natural law. But the curse that struck Harry did not find the clear path to death that it had always known before, instead encountering forces that transformed its destructive power into something approaching mercy. The death that Harry experienced was both real and illusory, his consciousness separating from his body, while remaining tethered to life through bonds that Voldemort himself had created through his use of Harry's blood in his resurrection ritual. The protection that Lily Potter's sacrifice had woven into her son's very essence had been preserved and strengthened through that incorporation, creating a paradox that the Dark Lord's fractured understanding could never have anticipated. The white space where Harry found himself during his temporary death was both destination and crossroads, a place beyond normal reality, where choices could be made about the nature of existence and the meaning of sacrifice. Here, among shadows that might have been King's Cross Station, or might have been something far more fundamental to the architecture of reality itself, he encountered both Dumbledore's shade and the remnant of Voldemort's soul that had lived within him since childhood. The conversation with Dumbledore's spirit provided the final pieces of understanding that Harry needed to comprehend his role in the cosmic struggle between good and evil, revealing how every aspect of his life had been shaped by forces far greater than personal choice or individual will. But it also offered him the option that few who had crossed the threshold of death had ever been given, the choice to return to life and complete the mission that had brought him to this moment of ultimate sacrifice. The fragment of Voldemort's soul that had resided within Harry appeared in this liminal space as something pitiable rather than terrifying, a piece of consciousness so damaged by its separation from humanity that it could exist only as a source of pain and corruption. Its destruction through Harry's willing sacrifice was both justice and mercy, the elimination of evil that had become too twisted to deserve continued existence in any form. The decision to return to life was made not from fear of death, but from love of those who would continue to suffer if Voldemort's reign of terror was allowed to continue. Harry's resurrection was powered by the same forces that had protected him as an infant. Love transformed into magic so powerful that it could overcome even the finality of death itself, when the cause was sufficiently worthy of such intervention. His awakening in the forest clearing came with the knowledge that the Horcrux within him had been destroyed, its elimination freeing both him and Voldemort from the connection that had bound them together since that night in Godric's Hollow. But the destruction of one soul fragment had also alerted the Dark Lord to the systematic elimination of all his anchors to immortality, filling him with a terror more profound than any he had ever experienced in his long existence. The decision to feign death rather than revealing his survival was made in an instant of tactical calculation, recognizing that the element of surprise might prove crucial in the final confrontation that would determine the war's outcome. Lying motionless among the forest debris, while Voldemort confirmed his apparent death required a form of courage different from any he had previously demonstrated, the discipline to remain still, while his enemy gloated over what appeared to be ultimate victory. But even as Harry maintained his deathly facade, Voldemort was beginning to understand the magnitude of what his apparent triumph had cost him. The destruction of the Harry Horcrux had left him with only one remaining anchor to immortality, Nagini, the great serpent who had served as both companion and protector throughout his second rise to power. The realization that his carefully constructed network of soul fragments had been systematically eliminated filled him with a panic that transcended rational thought. The march back to Hogwarts with Harry's apparently lifeless body was intended as a procession of triumph that would break the spirit of all who had dared to resist Voldemort's will. But the sight of the boy who lived carried like a trophy by his enemies had the opposite effect, igniting a rage in the defenders that transformed grief into a weapon more powerful than any spell or curse. Neville Longbottom's defiant speech in the face of Voldemort's demands for surrender represented the purest expression of courage that the magical world had ever witnessed, the refusal to bow to tyranny even when all hope seemed lost. His words carried the weight of every sacrifice that had been made in the fight against darkness, honoring the memory of all who had died while declaring that their deaths would not be meaningless if others continued to stand against evil. The sorting hats burning on Neville's head created the moment of maximum despair that preceded the revelation of hope, the apparent destruction of one of Hogwarts' most sacred artifacts, serving as the catalyst for magic that had been dormant since the school's founding. From the flames emerged the Sword of Gryffindor, that blade which had been imbued with the power to destroy evil through its contact with basilisk venom and its connection to the courage that Godric Gryffindor had embodied. The battle that erupted with the arrival of reinforcements from throughout the wizarding world marked the beginning of the final phase of a conflict that had shaped magical Britain for decades. Centaurs from the Forbidden Forest, house elves from the castle's kitchens, members of the Order of the Phoenix, students and teachers who had refused to flee, all converged upon Hogwarts in a desperate attempt to prevent evil from achieving the total victory that seemed within its grasp. But amid the chaos of this larger battle, the most crucial confrontation was the quiet moment when Neville Longbottom raised the Sword of Gryffindor and brought it down upon Nagini's serpentine form with all the force that righteous anger could muster. The blade that had been consecrated through contact with basilisk venom found its mark with precision that seemed guided by destiny itself, severing the great snake's head from her body and destroying the final Horcrux in a single decisive blow. The moment of Nagini's death marked the end of Voldemort's immortality and the restoration of his vulnerability to the same mortality that governed all other living beings. The terror that filled him as he felt his last anchor to existence destroyed was unlike anything he had experienced since his first encounter with death as Tom Riddle. The return of mortal fear to a consciousness that had transcended such limitations through the systematic violation of natural law. Harry's revelation of his survival created a moment of stunned silence that seemed to encompass the entire battlefield. The impossible made manifest through forces that neither science nor magic could fully explain. His emergence from apparent death was more than tactical surprise but symbolic rebirth, the triumph of love over hatred made visible through the resurrection of someone who had willingly sacrificed everything for the sake of others. The final duel between Harry Potter and Lord Voldemort was fought not in some grand arena designed for such momentous confrontations, but in the Great Hall of Hogwarts, surrounded by the debris of battle, and witnessed by everyone who had survived the night's carnage. It was a fight between equals in terms of magical power, but absolute opposites in terms of the forces they represented and the principles that guided their actions. But the outcome was determined not by superior spellcasting or tactical advantage, but by the fundamental difference in their natures and the choices they had made throughout their lives. Voldemort's killing curse, cast with all the hatred and malice that remained in his fractured soul, met Harry's Expelliarmus with its simple desire to disarm rather than destroy, and the Elder Wand that Voldemort wielded recognized its true master in the young man who had claimed it through conquest rather than murder. The rebound of the curse that destroyed Voldemort was both justice and inevitability. The Dark Lord's own evil turned against him through forces that he had never understood. Despite his centuries of magical study, his death was swift and final. The body that collapsed to the Great Hall floor, containing no soul fragments to ensure his continued existence, no Horcruxes to anchor his consciousness to the world of the living. The silence that followed Voldemort's death was profound and complete, the kind of quiet that comes when something fundamental about the nature of reality has been altered, and the world itself needs time to adjust to new patterns of existence. The Dark Lord who had terrorized magical Britain for decades was gone. His threat eliminated not through overwhelming force, but through the simple power of love and sacrifice that he had never been able to comprehend or overcome. But even as the wizarding world celebrated the end of the war that had defined their lives for so long, the cost of victory was measured in lives lost and innocence destroyed, in families broken and communities shattered by years of conflict that had demanded everything from those who had chosen to stand against the darkness. The peace that followed would be built upon foundations of sacrifice that could never be forgotten or taken for granted. The boy who had lived became the man who had conquered death itself, not through the dark magic that Voldemort had employed, but through the willing acceptance of mortality and the recognition that some things were worth dying for. His survival was both gift and responsibility, the chance to build a better world from the ruins of the old while honoring the memory of all who had fallen in service to that vision. The destruction of all 7 Horcruxes marked the end of an experiment in immortality that had cost the wizarding world more than could ever be calculated. The elimination of soul fragments that had corrupted the very air around them through their presence in the world. With their destruction came the restoration of natural order, the return of death as a boundary that even the most powerful wizards could not cross without paying prices that made the victory meaningless. The timeline of Voldemort's Horcruxes had reached its conclusion with the death of their creator and the restoration of justice to a world that had suffered under tyranny for far too long. The artifacts that had once contained fragments of the darkest soul in magical history were now merely objects again, their terrible purpose fulfilled, and their threat eliminated through the courage of those who had refused to bow to evil, regardless of the personal cost. The final Horcrux had been destroyed, the last fragment of Tom Riddle's fractured soul eliminated from existence. And with it ended the darkest chapter in the history of the wizarding world. The boy who had been born from love had triumphed over the monster who had been created from hatred, proving that some forces were indeed more powerful than death itself when wielded by hearts pure enough to understand their true nature and brave enough to pay whatever price their use demanded. And so ends the dark chronicle of Voldemort's Horcruxes, dear dreamer. 7 fragments of a soul, scattered across Britain like seeds of evil, each one a testament to the price of immortality sought through murder and darkness. From a simple diary to a beloved snake, each Horcrux represented not just a piece of Tom Riddle's soul, but a piece of his humanity willingly destroyed. In your dreams tonight, let this tale remind you that some prices are too high to pay, that the fear of death can lead to fates far worse than mortality itself. The boy who split his soul seeking to live forever instead doomed himself to a half-life of shadow and pain, until brave hearts and loving sacrifice finally restored the natural order. Rest now in the knowledge that love proved stronger than the darkest magic, that friendship conquered the most elaborate schemes, and that even the most fractured soul can find peace in the end, not through Horcruxes, but through acceptance of our shared humanity. Sweet dreams, and may your soul remain whole and your heart remain pure, protected by the same ancient magic that once defeated the darkest wizard of all time.